So good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for being here for our More Voices, Stronger Democracy and celebration of the 50th anniversary of Section 203, the Federal Voting Rights Act. My name is Darius Kemp. I'm the new Executive Director for California Common Cause. I'm excited to be here. I hope you are all able to catch the August 6th webinar on the history of Section 203. There is a video available for you to view on the evolution and the stages of Section 203 over the years. The full video of the event is up on the website, and there's also some suggested readings, which can also be accessed through some QR codes, which should be around here on the screens today. But today is an opportunity for our community to come together and to chart a path forward for a more inclusive democracy. Together, we are advocates, election officials, academics, and more, all passionate about eliminating the barriers to the ballot for immigrant voters. So I want to give a very big thanks for today to the Haas Jr., for sponsoring the event. So please give a round of applause. Also, I want to thank our host organizations, the Asian Law Caucus, the ACLU of Southern California, the Partnership for Advancement of New Americans, and my team at Common Cause. But in particular, I want to thank Pedro Hernandez, who helped lead this work from our team, who is amazing as our policy director. So thank you, Pedro. And also, none of this would have been possible today without amazing logistical support and strategic support from the Everyday Impact Consulting team. You may have met them when you got your badges, so please give them a round of applause as well. You will notice some books and reports on the table. Some of these organizations that I just mentioned have published recent reports on the subject of language access, which you will find there. Please help yourself. Take as many of them home as you would like, right? I think that's there's more than enough for everybody, so please take as many as you need. So today, before we get into more speeches and the amazing sessions we have planned, I want to welcome someone amazing to the stage, Jesse Salinas, the Chief Elections Officer for our neighboring county of Yolo. If you are not from California, yes, it is true, we have a Yolo County. So I know you're excited to visit. And Jesse is also the president of the California Association of Clerks and Elections Officials. Jesse has a powerful personal story that starts in Oakland, California in the 1970s, a very specific and very chaotic time and place. Through hustle and grit and resilience, Jesse's story takes him to UC Santa Cruz. Go Banana Slugs? Go Banana Slugs. He also is a proud graduate of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. Go Bears. All right. I am also an alumnus of that amazing organization and institution as well. That also led him to a long career in nonprofits and almost 10 years as the head of elections at Yolo. Jesse is one of the most resourceful, ambitious, and innovative election officials we have, and an ally to those who want to think creatively about expanding access to the ballot as well. Jesse will be sharing a little bit about his experiences and also introducing our amazing Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. But I do want to also highlight one additional thing about Jesse. He was a diehard Raiders fan until they left the city of Oakland. So just know that if you're not a Raiders fan either, you have a friend in Jesse right now. So I want to welcome to the stage right now, Jesse Salinas.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? So beautiful day in Sacramento. Thankfully, you're indoors and not outdoors, right? It's warm out there. So again, welcome to this wonderful summit that you all are about to experience. And those who speak Spanish, bienvenidos. Qué bueno que estás aquí adentro de la casa y no afuera, que no. For those of you just emphasizing the importance of being indoors on this hot day. So I wanted to, first of all, thank you very much, Darius, for the kind comments and the introduction. I also wanted to take this time to share with you a little bit more before I have the honor of introducing our Secretary, Dr. Shirley Weber. So as I look at my background and having grown up in Oakland, and it's true, those were the original Raiders back in the day. It was really quite a challenging time, to say the least. And one of the things I discovered early on is the importance of translations. So I used to translate for my mom. She was from Mexico, and she preferred speaking Spanish. So had that early on, but even beyond that, in those elements, what I discovered early on was the fact that it could make a difference at all levels. And I remember being actually in 4th grade, and this student of ours walked into the classroom. He came straight from Mexico, and he didn't speak a word of English, did not understand what was happening, and he was petrified in the classroom. And I looked at him, and the teacher said, I don't know how to speak Spanish. Is there anybody here that speaks Spanish? So I raised my hand. And she goes, would you help him? And so I spent the next 2-3 months, he was my shadow. Everything that happened, I would explain to him in the classroom, out on the playground, everything. And what I could see in this colleague of mine, this fellow student, is just awe of wanting to learn and having the opportunity to have somebody help them with that translation. And I could see he was just so thankful that I was there for him to be able to answer those questions. And when I think back on it, he went from a struggling student that by the end of the year, he was getting A's and B's. And that's what's capable, right, at all ages. And when I think back, even when I first came into office, one of the things that happened, and it's a story that Jonathan and I have, Jonathan Stein, he was with the Asian Law Caucus at the time, and our first meeting together, he'll recall, was, hey, Jesse, we're going to sue you because you are terrible in Yolo County when it comes to meeting your legal requirements. And I have to tell you, Jonathan, I was on the job for a few months because I got sworn in May of 2016. So what a year to get sworn in, right? 2016, I was in the job for literally less than a month, right? And then we have this June 2016 election that took place. And then I get this really warm, wonderful letter from Jonathan saying, we're going to sue you. You are absolutely horrible in Yolo County. And so I called my staff and I said, who is this guy? I mean, is this even a real organization? And they go, no, it's legit. They're a real organization. And I'm like, okay. So thankfully, Jonathan reached out and I said, well, come on up to Yolo County. I want to get to know you. You can get to know me. And what we found out, one is he's also a Bear alum. He's a Golden Skull alum as well. And we had a chance to talk. And he realized that I was just as stunned as he was to find out how poor we were doing. Because I shared with them that translations mean a lot to me because of my upbringing. And we partnered. Because he gave us a report on that first election. We were the worst performing county in every metric you can think of. And when they did their analysis for that June 2016, and I said, this will change. And we partnered. We worked in ways that I probably had never really been done before as a county with Asian Law Caucus. And I remember he called me in December after that November election. And he says, Jesse, you went from worst to first. And I just want to give to Jonathan. The partnership that we had helped make that happen, and I thank you for that. And we continue to strive to move forward. And in fact, that translation ballot, because we did some innovative stuff, as you know, in Yolo County, it still hangs up on my wall, and it shows the translations that we did at the time. So to give you a little bit of context as well, So in Yolo County, we do meet not only our state requirements of doing Spanish, there's a large Spanish-speaking population in Yolo County. Yes, it is Yolo County, where you only live once. Yolo County. We have Spanish, a large Spanish-speaking population, but we also have a large Chinese population, and a lot of it has to do with the drive of the university. There's a lot of Asian students. There's a large Korean population, which is another one of our language requirements, Punjabi. But I didn't stop there, and Jonathan knows the story. I reached out because every time I went to a polling place training in that first election in West Sacramento, the poll workers would say, okay, Jesse, that's great, you're going to do those languages, but what are you doing about the Russian-speaking population? We have a large Russian-speaking population here in West Sacramento. And I said, okay. Next training, the same question was asked, and I said, okay, there's something here. So we made an effort in Yolo County to also provide translations above and beyond our state requirements, and they're also doing it in Russian. Because that community needs it, it makes a difference. So I share this with you because we continue to make not just the minimum requirements, we expect to exceed those and to excel. And I want to give a shout out also to the Walter and Evelyn Haas Fund, because they actually provided us some creative funding opportunities to be able to do some outreach to increase voter turnout in the last election cycle. So we were able to engage, thanks to some funding that we matched at the local level, to do funding to engage the nonprofits, because they are the ones that have the relationships in the community, the trusted relationships. So we had a strong focus on those neighborhoods that we knew were low performing in terms of turnout, and we wanted to raise the bar, and we started to really provide some guidance on using some messaging, but really look to them to see how they connected with their community. And so we actually did that. We did a small pilot in the March election, and so it was exciting because we got a little bit of traction on that, and then we did a bigger one in the larger general. And so we have more nonprofits. And the report's going to be coming out soon, and it's going to be an exciting report. We created an app that when nonprofits are going out in the community, they can say, this is the house that we actually talked to, or we dropped off some information, and we're going to continue to take that to the next level, because we want to know how we can more effectively reach the community in the different languages. So we focus on the languages, we focus on all the languages I just described, and we focus on young voters, those 18 to 25. And at the end of the day, the work that's happening here is what's going to make a difference. As I saw that video, I could see myself in that video, and I was heartened by just seeing the passion and the care that was in there. So with that, I just wanted to be able to just give you that little background on myself. And now I get the distinct honor of being able to introduce our esteemed Honorable Dr. Shirley Weber. I'm going to give you a little background on Dr. Weber. So she was sworn into office as California's Secretary of State, January 2021. Secretary Weber is California's first Black Secretary of State. In fact, Secretary Weber was born to sharecroppers in Hope, Arkansas, during the segregationist Jim Crow era. Her father, who left Arkansas after being threatened by a lynch mob, did not have the opportunity to vote until he was in his 30s. Although her family moved to California when Secretary Weber was 3 years old, it was her family's experience in the Jim Crow South that has driven her activism and her legislative work. She has fought to secure and expand civil rights for all Californians, including restoring voting rights for individuals who have completed their prison terms. Secretary Weber attended the University of California, UCLA, where she received her BA, her MA, and her PhD. Prior to receiving her doctorate, she became a professor at San Diego State University at the age of 23. Can you believe that? The age of 23. We know she's a brilliant woman. That just kind of verifies that she is. She retired from the Department of Africana Studies after 40 years as a faculty member and serving several times as department chair. And just so you all know, back in the day in the 90s, I actually worked for a state senator who was a professor for a few years. And her comment to me is, you know what, the Capitol is nothing compared to the politics of higher education. So the fact that she was chair multiple times kind of shows to her acumen and her ability to handle politics. Before her appointment as Secretary of State, Secretary Weber served 4 terms as the Assembly member representing California's 79th Assembly District, which includes parts of the city of San Diego, as well as several cities and communities in the San Diego region. Over the past few years, I have gotten to know Secretary Weber on a more personal level and have found our conversations incredibly enjoyable and memorable. Her commitment and passion to provide education and voting access to California voters is real and authentic. Please join me in welcoming my friend, the Honorable Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Staff tries to help you,
Yeah.
but it's all good. Good morning. Want to thank Jesse for his kind comments and for those who are in charge of Common Cause and all of the wonderful organizations that are here for inviting me to be with you this morning. As I looked at the video, like so many of you, you could always remember things that were similar to it, if not identical to it. The desire for people to learn, the desire for people to know, and surely the desire for folks to participate and be active in their own lives. You know, as I looked at that, I thought of my parents who spoke English, but my dad particularly was never really allowed to go to school. So he knew how to write his name, but he didn't know a whole lot else until he came to California. But I remember my dad sitting at the table the night before every election, and my mother and my dad going over the ballot. My mom had gone as far as the 9th grade, so she could read, and he thought she was the smartest woman he ever met. And they would go over every ballot issue and read to him exactly what it was about, what the pros and cons, and have that conversation. But without her, he would probably not been able to vote as well as he did and participate in the process. So even though they spoke English, they were limited in their ability to actually read. And I have to believe in some point that's why some folks did not go to the ballot box and did not participate, because they really didn't understand. And they really didn't want to make a bad decision. Because so often after you vote, even when you read, you discover that the analysis was not what it said. And you're furious that you allowed them to take away our ballot issues, like the whole issue of bail, as we lost in an election because people didn't understand what they were voting for. And so it is a critical issue when we talk about literacy, not just the language that you speak, but how we put our ballot initiatives together, how we educate the public about what it means, what the pros and cons are, and how they can make good decisions. At least when they vote, they know what they voted for, and not discover the next day that that's not what they wanted. We're in the midst of a real challenge, as we know, and you're going to be discussing a lot of that today. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of being careful and deliberative and thoughtful about what we're doing, because most folks don't expect us to do that. They don't expect us to be deliberate and thoughtful about what we're doing and press hard to make sure it happens. And so as a result, we look at ourselves in 2025 and wonder what happened. Where did all the good stuff go? Where did we lose some things? You know, what happened to the enthusiasm, the passion, the desire to make us move forward? And we don't have a lot of Jessies around. We have a lot of folks who do what is told to do. But Jesse has the passion and the drive and the commitment to make it happen. He's never going to let me get rid of that. What is your program that deals with young people and Youth Empowerment Summit? He is never going to let me ever forget that, and that's good. He's going to stay on top of me because that's good. And he's going to make sure that every get an opportunity we get to fund it or to figure out how we can expand it, it's good. Because people talk about civic engagement, but they don't fund it. They don't put their energy into it. They act like it's going to happen on its own somewhere, and as a result makes it even more difficult, if not impossible, to move forward with it. But you have the passion and you have the drive and you have the desire to make it happen. I cannot overemphasize that enough. We are in peril right now, and I think you know that in terms of the whole concept of election. With all the work you've done, all of our efforts to expand the voting opportunity for so many. You know, we have our space, our words, more days, more ways to vote in California. And we do our best to try to make sure we get all of those individuals to the polls, that we register folks, and we go in places we've never been before in the Secretary of State's office. We go way out in Calexico, and folks were shocked that we came to Calexico. The whole town turned out for us in Calexico because we were there to talk to the schools and the young people, and the board of supervisors came, and the city council came, and some other group and some other group. And so it was the first time we'd actually gone there to say, we want you to register to vote. We want you to participate. And because we hadn't been there so often to say that, people took advantage of those who had the desire to learn, the desire to vote, and did not provide them with all of the resources and support that they needed. So our staff went there, and we've continued to go back, and we'll continue to go back to make sure that those folks who are often forgotten about somewhere, that they truly want to vote. They truly want to participate. And there's some agencies that are working with us to make that happen. But it is extremely important that we do that. People marvel at the fact that right now in California, 84% of all of those who are eligible to vote are registered. 84%. It's amazing. And that's because we've gone in a whole lot of places. That's also because you can register online, that you can do it easy. You don't have to create this tremendous experience just to go to register to vote. You know, I often talk about what happened in the South in terms of those who were not allowed, like my dad was not allowed to vote, and going to register to vote could have meant your life. But I also talk about my friend Toni Atkins, who told me that her parents never voted until they were adults. And in fact, she was in college when her parents first registered to vote. And these are folks who were coal miners, but in order to register to vote, you had to go to the county seat to register to vote. And her mother did piecework, and her dad worked in the coal mines. So they could not take off from work to actually go register to vote. And there was no one open on Saturdays, and there were not people sitting in front of the grocery stores registering people as they are today. You literally had to go to the county seat in Virginia in order to register to vote. And so you can imagine they just decided that somebody else would take care of it. Someone else will obviously run the state. Someone else will obviously make decisions for them and their family. Someone else will obviously impact labor because they are people who cannot take off a day to go register to vote. And she finally talked them into it when she was in college and campaigning for different issues. Her parents finally conceded and took off a day of work in order to go register to vote. That is a major sacrifice for a family, and it should not be. It should be easy, it should be accessible, it should be something that is naturally done. It should be done in all of our universities, and it is right now in terms of folks being able to register to vote when they actually register for classes, that they can register online, that they can register when they renew their license. All of these things are accessible now in California. I can tell you there's a constant effort to eliminate most of those things, to make it difficult for us to register to vote, to take away the right of women to vote, to reduce the number of women who vote by simply saying in order to register to vote, you have to have a birth certificate with your name on it that you're registering under. And most of us don't have birth certificates done when we were babies with our married name on it. And so as a result, those things become opportunities, become obstacles, barriers to getting folks to vote, register to vote, barriers to participating. And it sounds simple, but it's not. I had a woman who was almost 100 years old call me the other day, called me through my sister from church and said, I need to figure out how I need to get a birth certificate. Because if they change all these rules, I want to vote. And I don't have a birth certificate. She's almost 100 years old, and she doesn't have a birth certificate. I can understand that. My parents were born at home. They were born by midwives. I was born by a midwife in Hope, Arkansas. So eventually we got birth certificates through some method that we had to get in order to go to school, but it was not produced at the date and time I was born. And so it becomes important we understand that this is a very diverse state, it's a very diverse nation, and people have a right to vote. And we should not create obstacles, we should create opportunities for people to vote. And the same is true with the language. We are proud in California that we have a very diverse state. And there are many efforts to basically take that away from us. And instead of restricting, we should be expanding the opportunity, not only for those who speak a different language, but for those who are English who can speak a language themselves. We're probably the only country that has basically, that most of us are monolingual. We only speak English and sometimes not that well. And we don't bring in the communities that exist around us, and they act like it's impossible. I said, there's not a kid in San Diego who should not speak Spanish, period. Because they play with the kids every day. They play in the play yards. They go to the store with them. Why shouldn't they do like every other country? The kids you speak their language, and they speak your language. And so why have we shut ourselves off? But it's because we really do not want to include everybody. We only want to include ourselves. We want to eliminate anyone who looks differently than us and who speaks differently than us. And so therefore that drive is not there. When I used to take my students to South Africa, the young people to South Africa, and we'd meet with these young people who would take us around in South Africa. And they would say, well, how many languages, they would always ask their students from South Africa, how many languages do you speak? They were able to speak English and a couple of other languages. And they say, I'm really sorry, there are 10 languages in our country, and I only speak 9. But I do understand the 10th one quite well. And I would say, you cannot apologize to us. We are not the people you apologize for only knowing 9 of the 10 languages. These are the people who know 1 out of 10, not 9 out of 10. And so it's really always interesting that they felt it was a part of their life. It was a part of what they do. And the embracing of others and languages is critically important. So I'm optimistic, as I keep telling folks every day with our school systems and what have you, that at some point we'll wake up and realize that we're sitting in a gold mine, and that gold mine is diversity. And that we will continue to expand and expand until there is nothing left for our kids not to expand. And we have an opportunity and a responsibility to do it. And it seems so easy and so natural if we just gave into it and let our kids and everyone else basically learn the languages that they go to school with, that they're a part of, and we'd be surprised how it transforms our community as it does around the world. So I'm honored today to be with you here and with all of the organizations that are here. Our office is always open and welcome. Some of you serve on our LAC committee, Language Access Committee. That's extremely important. And we will continue to fight for that. But you need to know that at one point we're fighting here, and then there's another point that's making every effort in the world to make sure that we don't register every Californian, that we challenge every Californian, that we deal with voter ID so that we can eliminate people from voting, make it harder for people to come to the polls to work. We want to eliminate now vote by mail, which is interesting to me because most of the folks who want to eliminate it used to only vote by mail. And they did not like going in with the ordinary people to vote. And so they voted by mail as an exclusive club in Florida, the Vote by Mail Club. And so as a result, now they want to eliminate it completely. We don't need vote by mail, it's suspicious, it's something's wrong with it, and so forth and so on, and it goes on and on and on. So we're fighting those battles because we know if we eliminate vote by mail, or if they put more barriers on vote by mail so that you now have to have ID to vote by mail, you'd have to have technology to look at your picture and see it and sit it in with your ballot. I mean, these things are barriers. These are not things that everybody has and even know how to use or do. And so we have to continue to fight to make sure that every Californian has the access, has the ability to access and to vote without obstructions, without barriers that are there. We did it in the past when we had all those Jim Crow laws and all those rules and regulations and poll taxes and everything else that were there. We don't need them anymore. And in fact, I'm going to go to a committee meeting in a minute when they'll talk about, well, how much fraud is there in California? There is no fraud in California. It's impossible to believe that in all of the 26 million potential voters in California, we don't have any fraud cases. Why? Because people believe in voting. If you actually commit fraud, it is a felony. And who's going to risk one vote out of 26 million and spend time in jail? It's irrational. It's illogical. It doesn't happen. And so as a result, we're going to continue to push and push and push to make sure that these barriers do not stand in the way of all of Californians who are citizens of this country who actually want to vote and must vote. Our job is to encourage them to expand the opportunity and to make sure what we do is correct and that we do provide more ways and more days for Californians to express themselves and have their wishes heard and responded to. So I'm excited about your outcome. I thank you for all the reports that you've done for us in terms of language access and voting. I appreciate that. That information is invaluable. We want to make sure that everyone gets it. We'll take some with us when we leave. But understand that you are our partner in this. We're all working together to make sure that California maintains this strong and vibrant population of individuals who have a desire to participate in the political process of California and to change the nation and make California and the United States a stronger nation than ever before. Once again, thank you so much.
We're here to mark the 50th anniversary of Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, one of the most important civil rights protections for voters who speak languages other than English. And it's a law that's opened the ballot to millions, changed how elections are run, and reminds us that our democracy works best when it works for all of us. But anniversaries aren't just for looking back. They're also for asking the harder questions. Is this enough? What's still missing? And how do we make sure the next 50 years are even more inclusive? We're lucky to have 3 people here to help us answer those questions from every angle, research, policy, and lived experience. Dr. Matt Barreto is one of the nation's leading experts on political participation among Latino immigrant communities and co-founder of UCLA's Voting Rights Project. He spent decades tracking the impact of language access on turnout and representation. Dr. Anar Parikh brings deep insight into AAPI political behavior, especially for communities often made invisible in aggregate data. Her work asks how our policies can match the realities of diverse and multilingual voters. And Diego Casillas is a political scientist whose research zeroes in on the relationship between Section 203 and turnout for voters with limited English proficiency, work that challenges assumptions and offers the hard numbers they need. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to get started, and I'll let you, Matt, take it away.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Pedro, Jonathan, Raul from Haas for inviting us and hosting this today. I'm just going to start with just a couple of summary data points, and then happy to hear questions from Pedro and from my fellow panelists, and talk about the impact that Section 203 has had. So as we know, the direct objective of Section 203 is to make sure that all official government materials are in language. So that's everything from the ballots themselves, the voter's guides, any instructions that you might need in terms of how to vote, where to vote, what the cost is for stamps. We sued a county in Georgia once because they didn't provide any information about how the longer ballot was going to require extra stamps, and we found that non-English speaking voters didn't have that information. So any information that the government provides is meant to be. But there's also an entire literature that I've contributed to a little bit, but I'm going to summarize for you, but what we call spillover effects or positive externalities. Diego is going to talk about the actual direct effects of Section 203 and how it increases turnout. But in addition to that, when there is bilingual coverage in a jurisdiction, it signals the campaigns that they need to conduct in-language outreach. And I can tell you from being on campaigns that when you are in a Section 203 county, you increase the amount of outreach that you are doing in those languages. And so there should be campaign effects that we want to study. Secondly, it signals to local media that, especially when coverage is first extended for the first time, there's tons of news stories. And suddenly the local media is checking and seeing what's going on in the Vietnamese American community, in the Korean American community, as you saw in the videos. And so there's a lot of, again, these are not government actions. These are other actors who are taking the baton and they are doing increased in-language mobilization. So that's what I'm going to talk about is these spillover effects. So there are additional important effects besides just the direct translation. Let's start a little bit with the history of when did we start doing campaigns. And not just the ballots, but we want the campaigns and the candidates and the issue campaigns speaking to voters in their language, not just having the ballot available. This started all the way back even before the celebrated 1975 extension 50 years ago with Jackie Kennedy doing an entire Spanish language commercial in the presidential election under the Viva Kennedy rubric. And so this happened before we even had Spanish language ballots. Reagan, coming from California, and this is post-1975 language ballots, had Reagan para Presidente and lots of Spanish language outreach here, both California and nationally. We saw that extend to other campaigns, certainly, across the years, and here was George W. Bush, who probably did some of the most extensive early Spanish language outreach, and if you look at it, it tracked very heavily with where there were Spanish language ballots, that he was running his ads in these same counties where there were Spanish language ballots. Of course, we know that this extended, and Barack Obama probably expanded this more than any other presidential candidate in his 2008 and 2012 campaign, where he launched his ads specifically targeting voters in language and TV and radio. And then Clinton not only extended that, but as you see here in the underline, ads that were aired in Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and other languages. And so her campaign took that to another level, matched what was available by Section 203, and was serving additional ads to voters. And we had even infamously, perhaps, the antagonist in this is even President Trump started running ads while criticizing Spanish language ballots. Somehow his campaign convinced him to run Spanish language ads for voters. And so we know that this was happening. Let me just summarize this by saying that there has been extensive peer-reviewed published research studies that document increased voter turnout among both Latino and Asian Americans given exposure to in-language campaign ads. So again, Diego's going to tell us about the actual 203 coverage in those materials. But we know that when there are additional ads by the candidates and the campaigns, turnout goes up. Research also documents that when there are Section 203 counties, that there's further news consumption. And you saw a little bit of this in the ads that were displayed. You heard the Korean American family talking about how they're reading more and they're paying attention more and they're seeing this in their community. It's not just the counties that are providing this information, but the local news coverage of it. And then finally, community-based organizations. We heard the story about Jonathan working with Mr. Salinas in getting that out. There's actual, this is not just an anecdote, there's actual published studies that document this. When there is a Section 203 coverage extended, community groups will serve as monitors and watchdogs to make sure that that access is being fulfilled, and that's how we help get it enforced. And so, in addition to the direct effects, there's additional spillover effects that I wanted to talk about. So where do we go from here? Well, in 1975, this was enacted. It was unchanged for a while. In 1992, the 10,000 person threshold was established. Nothing happened until 2006, when the census ACS data allowed us to update the formula every 5 years. So now we get updates every 5 years on which counties are covered. But that's basically where it stopped. We have not had significant updates to language access at the federal level since 2006. We need better monitoring enforcement. We need additional languages. And we need state level mandates for those states with very, very large non-English speakers. And states can go beyond what the federal government is doing. Thank you. I'll leave it there and turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Before we move on, I wanted to ask you one, maybe two follow-up questions, which is, you've been tracking the story of language access for decades. When you zoom out, what's changed in the way academics and policymakers understand its role in a healthy democracy?
Yeah, thanks, Pedro, for pointing out my age and that I've been doing this for decades. I have actually wrote the first paper on this in 2000 during the George W. Bush presidency, and those language access, or those Spanish commercials that he ran in the 2000 presidential. Was the first paper I published on this topic. And the one thing I want to say is that community groups and campaigns in the media, as I highlighted here, have now come fully into the picture in a way that it used to just be litigators and voting rights experts who were monitoring and paying attention to this. But the Section 203 is so important in that it signifies and symbolizes that growing immigrant voting citizen community in the county. And it sends a signal not just to the media, but of course the community groups already know, but to the campaigns. The campaigns have really changed dramatically in the last 20 years. And so that gives us as social scientists new data to chew on and study and analyze. And so there's a lot more data out there for us to look at. And I think you've started to see the language access research get much more sophisticated, much more data oriented, and it makes our analysis much richer.
And I'll ask you one follow-up question to that was, what's one misconception about language access and turnout you wish every election official from the smallest county to the federal level would leave behind?
I think the biggest misconception is that they only need to provide the ballots themselves in the language, and that's where their responsibilities stop. I think that's what most people assume, but the letter of the law says that all materials that county provides in English to assist English-speaking voters in understanding where their polling place is, what date early voting starts. Every single piece of information needs to be provided in language, and I think all of us can encourage. We found a number of counties that are only in so-so compliance. They say they're complying, but they're not fully compliant. And there's a lot of work for all of us to do as monitors to make sure that every county that is covered by Section 203 is fully compliant. That means if there's a gentleman or a woman at the front desk whose job is to answer questions for English-speaking voters, they have to also have that in language. And the more we realize the full extent of Section 203 coverage, the more we can take full advantage of it.
Thank you. I will hand it over to Diego for your presentation.
Okay. Excuse me. Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me? Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Pedro, for having us here today. My name is Diego Casillas. I am a research fellow at the UCLA Voting Rights Project. I am also a Ph.D. student in political science at UCLA. And I'm so honored and humbled to be here today. So thank you so much for your time. So let me summarize the findings of a research report that we conducted on Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act and its impact on Latino and Asian American or Asian turnout between the 2016 U.S. Census determinations and the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, and where we we measure the impact of Section 203 counties on the one hand, and we compare them with similar counties within their own state that were not under Section 203 coverage. The outcome, what we wanted to know, is the difference in turnout between 2016 into the 2020 general elections. So it's pretty straightforward. So let me walk you through a couple of maps because I like to show these two maps here. Why? Because it gives you a sense of the locations of the counties that were analyzed, and it also shows you the presence or the impact of Section 203 nationwide, as you can see from the screen on the map. Now, the counties, and perhaps take a second to look at the counties in California. Just as a one quick example, you can see that the counties in black, those are the counties under Section 203, and we know that California is still the statewide mandate, but most of these Section 203 counties are concentrated in California, Texas, and Florida, as you can see from the map. A key highlight that I want to emphasize today as well is those 19 counties outside the three big states that you see on your screen in red. These are 18 counties that received Section 203 coverage for the very first time in 50 years. That is, you love to see that. That is what we hope to continue we love to see this expansion of Section 203 outside of the big states, and just wanted to point that out this time around. The second map shows you the 41 counties for Asian languages at the county level. Again, the unit of analysis in our study is counties. So we're looking at counties. We know that Section 203, perhaps the different levels of coverage could be at the municipality level, at the, some places, but those are nested within counties, so we focus on counties. So 41 counties cover 4 Asian languages in this map. Okay, so what do we know? What have we learned in terms of Section 203 from previous studies? Some studies, in fact, I would argue a lot of studies, most studies show that Section 203 works, that is impactful, that allows language minority groups to engage in the political process. Some recent reports perhaps present mixed findings. None of those reports have specifically focused on the current effects of Section 203, specifically on our current political environment, looking at the 2016 or 2021 U.S. Census determinations. Moreover, or more importantly, we find that the API community and perhaps recent studies on Native American communities continue to be understudied, particularly in the state of California. Our study is the first nationwide study, not only that includes California, but it uses a difference in difference regression to measure turnout change between 2016 and 2020, and we validated turnout data for Latinos and Asian Americans at the county level to measure these changes. Now, let's go ahead and provide you the findings of our research report. First key finding is that Latino turnout increased by more than 3 percentage points on those Section 203 counties. Second finding is that Asian turnout nationwide increased this change in turnout by more than 6 percentage points. And perhaps when you focus those models on these Section 203 communities with larger, with high rates of Latino naturalized citizens or immigrants, you expect to see, we saw an effect of almost 20 percentage points increase, 20 points increase in turnout in 2020 alone. I said it before and I said it again, Section 203 continues to play a key role in activating language minority groups and turnout, not just in California, but nationwide. Thank you for your time today. That's all I got.
Diego, what's one finding from your study that really stayed with you? Something that changed the way you think and about the value of language access?
I really don't want to use any method today because I grew up in a community where we really needed a lot to engage one another. But in my findings, I not only show that those counties that receive Section 203 coverage for the first time see a positive impact, but those counties that have been under Section 203 coverage for a long time, that goes to the establishment of Section 203, and it goes to say that these counties these jurisdictions that continue to provide language access materials are perhaps doing their best to include communities that are often underrepresented in communities.
And your study shows statistical significant turnout gains for both Latino and API voters, even in places where coverage has existed for decades. If you had to boil it down to one number or takeaway to convince the skeptics that translated ballots are worth the investment, what would it be in mind?
My report shows, I think my report is very straightforward, and that's one of the reasons why I like it, right? Because it really goes to it really goes to show, we looked at the 2020 general election, and many of us can remember where were we in 2020, particularly late 2021. Our nation, not just our nation, but California, we were struggling with COVID-19 and other similar crisis effects. But you can see that even under those very tough circumstances, language minority groups under Section 203 still went out there and made their voices heard. And that really, to me, that goes, I'm showing that in the report that Section 203 worked in 2020, and it's got to continue to work moving forward.
Thank you. We'll hand it off to you.
Hi everyone. thank you all for having me here today, and thank you, Matt and Diego, for your insights and this conversation. I just want to say, first of all, that it's really an honor to be here. In many ways, being here is a kind of full circle experience of my career, and I won't go into it, but it's a small world. And just to give you a little bit of background about where I am coming from, my name is Dr. Narpreek, and I'll be talking about AAPI communities in Section 203. And to tell you about my background, I am an anthropologist and ethnographer by training. And I don't know if you all know anything about anthropology, but I would say at least 60% of anthropological methods are vibes. So what my data looks like is really different from what Diego and Matt's data looks like, but I think it builds nicely on what Diego talked about in terms of the lack of data that exists in terms of the impact of Section 203 and how important language access is in Asian American communities. I studied the implementation of Section 203 for Asian Indian voters in Chicago in 2017 and 2018. And for the past 3 years, I've been a senior policy associate and language access specialist at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. So where I'm coming from is really sort of hands in the mud, on the ground kind of experience in not just research, but in advocacy. And that's where the sort of framing that I would like to kind of start you off with. So Diego sort of showed us about a little bit of what coverage looked like for AAPI communities in after the 2016 determinations and its impact on the 2020 elections. This is just a little bit of an update on AAPI coverage, AAPI languages and coverage after the 2021 determinations. And we can see a pretty big expansion of the number of states and languages covered between 2016 and 2021. It goes up to 14 states, from 4 languages to 8 language groups, and 53 political subdivisions from 41. But 53 subdivisions in the entire country is a really quite a small amount. And most subdivisions are only covering 1, maybe 2 Asian languages. So the coverage is very, very limited. And with that, I think that I wanted to focus on two sort of things. One is the limits of Section 203, who gets left out in Asian America and beyond. We talked about the threshold being updated in 1992 to 5, which is now either 5% or 10,000 citizens of voting age for a particular language group. It's too high for most Asian American communities, meaning that language access requires supplemental state and local protections. The scope, and this goes beyond Asian America, but I think it's a good opportunity to just recognize that right now there's limited or non-existent avenues for coverage for language minority groups outside of the quote Spanish, Asian, Native American, and Alaska Native schema. This is one of the videos that we saw. Arabic is a big one in many communities across the country, where there's just no even a framework to collect data, either especially in the census or ACS, and then there's no framework for protection. Also for other African languages and indigenous communities from Central and South America, for example. And then, linguistic diversity in Asian America is also another sort of complexity around who gets included and who gets left out. And this is where the anthropologist in me comes in. The quote unquote language groups as used for coverage determinations. I put language groups in quotes because Asian Indian is not a language group. So, for example, even the way that we construct what is a language group is complicated. And then even within Asian Indian, for example, that encompasses speakers of at least a dozen commonly spoken languages. And if you read the Section 203 guidance, the policy gives local jurisdiction, sort of empowers local jurisdictions to work with community organizations to make determinations in cases when a quote unquote language group includes more than one language. And one thing that I found in Chicago is that the community groups that were being consulted actually were folks who were primarily English language, who spoke English, who used English ballots, and who were from hegemonic language groups. So for example, Hindi speakers. So it's not always either data or need informed because of the kind of power dynamics that exist within particular communities and community groups. And then the second piece to really talk about, and I recognize that I come in with a very critical perspective of what the implementation of this policy looks like, but I think it's especially important because of how much we've seen how important language access is, both in terms of turnout, in terms of symbolic impact, in terms of the positive externalities. And so there's a lot to talk about here too, but I'll just focus on two things beyond insights beyond beyond turnout and insights on voter impact. One is that there's inequity in implementation across political subdivisions. As Matt was talking about, often, even for Section 203, counties that have to comply to Section 203, it is not what we would consider full compliance. It's either just the ballots or some parts of the instructions, but not all of them. It really varies across languages. Insufficient resources, including budgetary staff capacity dedicated to implementing language access measures, and limited accommodations for varying in language literacy among language minority groups, including collapsing key differences between oral and textual forms of communication. One of the things that I have seen across counties, and this is recognizing, for the election officials who might be here, I know that recruiting poll workers in general is really, really hard, but counties tend to really lag on recruiting bilingual poll workers. So the having folks at voting locations to help voters while they're actually voting is often very, very limited in scope. And then, as a data panel, there is very inconsistent to non-existent data and record keeping on the impact of language access efforts. All of us kind of come to this from a scholarly background, but even within the departments that have some type of coverage, data keeping is very limited. And then finally, there's a heavy reliance on anecdotes. I'm an anthropologist, I love an anecdote, and community advocacy. So, for example, in DeKalb County, Georgia, community groups advocated for, DeKalb County only provides supplemental materials, not ballots. That means sample ballots, some know before you vote instructions. But a number of years ago, community advocates advocated for Spanish and Korean translations for these supplemental materials. When we ran the data in 2023, Korean is probably 4th or 5th in size in DeKalb County for not just for limited quote. I also don't use the deficiency framework of quote limited English proficiency. We can talk about that offline, but yeah. So because when communities are more activated in a schema where there isn't ways to guarantee coverage, communities that have more robust advocacy infrastructures have more opportunities for even proactive coverage. And folks and communities where they may not be as activated or there are less resources for activation can be left out. So I'll stop there, but thank you all for your time. It's a lot to say.
I do have a follow-up question, Anar. Your work has zeroed in on AAPI communities, especially those who disappear in the averages. What does Section 203 mean on the ground for those voters?
Yeah, I think that it, in many cases it doesn't mean much because the coverage for Section 203 is so limited that many folks don't know that they may even have the right to access materials in languages other than English. And then, another piece, or what it means, is that it really depends on where you live, what kinds of coverage you can get, and what kinds of protections or resources that you can get. And it becomes just highly, highly variable.
Numbers pointed you in one direction, but the community's lived reality pointed you in another.
Yeah. So last year, I put together a report based on Advancing Justice Atlanta's election protection efforts. And in Gwinnett County, Georgia, the county is covered by Section 203 for Spanish, but the county does also do proactive translations in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And Advancing Justice Atlanta has an election protection program that places poll monitors at polling locations in Gwinnett County, among other counties in Georgia. And we had a Korean American volunteer who volunteered to be a poll worker in Gwinnett County, he was 90 years old and volunteering for the first time, wanting to help Korean speaking voters at the polls. I interviewed him for the report, and he told me that he wasn't able to help a single person because there were not Korean voters who needed language assistance who came to that particular polling site. And he sort of surmised that there must not be Korean. The only Koreans who are voting are the Koreans who speak English. And we really appreciate the work that this county has been doing to provide proactive language access. And at the same time, folks on the ground also may not be seeing the impacts of that because the scope of that, those measures is so limited.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a series of questions for a moderated discussion with our experts here that I'm excited to ask and engage on. I'd like to start with Matt. From the national trends that you've studied, what regional or demographic differences most shape how Section 203 plays out on the ground? And what should advocates and officials in this room keep in mind when pushing for change?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, as Pedro, because there is so much difference. You saw from the map that Diego presented, there's 3 states that also have what's called the statewide mandate. Those are the states with the largest number of Spanish speakers: California, Texas, and Florida. But even within there, as Diego highlighted, not all counties are equally covered. And I think that's something that's really important, is to understand that when you go into states, you often think of these states as providing a lot of language materials. That just means that the Secretary of State's office in each of those 3 states needs to be providing any statewide material. It doesn't mean that every single county is, and there are tons of not just regional, but sub-regional differences that I think are oftentimes unknown. In terms of regional variations, in terms of data that we've seen over the years, one of the things that we've noticed is that, and I think Anar's point to Asian languages is certainly much more stark than it is in the Latino community. But even within the Latino community, there might be differences in how Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans, other South American countries translate different election material and what they're accustomed to in their home country. And one of the things that I would encourage election officials to do is, based on the community, as Anar was just talking about, they need to work with the community to understand how are those materials translated. Gwinnett County, that was just mentioned, was providing Spanish language materials. I think they just came into coverage in 2016. They had almost nothing available other than the ballot. And so the UCLA Voting Rights Project issued a complaint letter to them saying, we think you're out of compliance. And if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you could face a lawsuit, but we're willing to work with you. And a week later, they put a Google translation bot on their website. And technically that met their criteria. But it wasn't providing a culturally relevant translation for people that would come onto the website to learn more about elections. And so I would say regionally, we really have to understand the community. What works with translations in Los Angeles or Phoenix might be very different than if you're in Orlando or Queens or other places. And so please take the sort of regional differences of your communities into account and work with them to get those materials available.
Yeah, I know, we've seen, looking around the room, and I recognize some election officials here who I've spoken to on this issue, and know that some of them are very mindful about making sure that they are addressing linguistic differences and kind of trying to get that input. But I know that this has been an issue when some languages first come online, especially under our state language requirements. Does anyone want to weigh in?
I'll just give a little bit of an update that, we work closely with Gwinnett County, and they actually, I've heard them, acknowledge these differences in the conversations I've had with them over the past 3 years, and they use, after they do the first round of translations by a vendor, they use volunteer community feedback groups to review the translations and consider the questions of whether it makes sense to have Puerto Rican Spanish versus Mexican Spanish versus, a variety of other Spanishes as well. So
I'll say just back to Gwinnett, because they're actually a well-intentioned county is what we found, because they had at least within a week of getting our letter said, oh, let's at least provide something. But it's the larger point that the counties are not getting the resources from the federal government. They get a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice that says, go provide stuff in Spanish, go provide stuff in Vietnamese. And they may not be ready to do that. So I think to Nar's point, there needs to be a little bit, and that was our intention. We weren't ready to sue them. But so it's actually, refreshing to hear that they have continue to make improvements. But there needs to be some mechanism of accountability, because these county officials, in most cases, there's certainly some that do not like complying with 203. But in most cases, these county officials, they want to do the right thing, but they don't have the resources or the knowledge.
And you've seen the way we talk about Section 203 and how people think about it. When we created it as civil rights guarantee instead of a voter assistance program, what shifts in organizing or in policy plans or how communities respond to that?
yeah, I think one point of reference, and a lot of the kind of language access protections that exist for folks are really kind of in precarious or sort of liminal places right now. But I think it's worth considering Executive Order 13166, which requires all federally funded programs to provide language access. So even if it's a state program that receives federal funding, they have to have a language access plan, and those plans are not based on thresholds. Those plans are, based on a sort of like broader conception of language access. So I think one thing that really changes is how we think about whether a group meets a threshold or not, or how we determine inclusion in these provisions. The other thing that, and I appreciate Fee for sort of offering this perspective, is that, or the reminder that Section 203 was meant to be a remedial measure. And I think if we think of it as a civil rights issue, it changes from a remedial measure that has to do with varying levels of literacy in English and relative to presumed levels of education or lack of education, to one that acknowledges that people have the right to move through the world using the language that they feel the most comfortable in. And I think that also requires us as advocates and organizers to unhinge or unfix ourselves from the idea of quote unquote limited English proficiency, meaning thinking about the need for access being tied to whether or not someone has a certain level of fluency or comfortability using English, and instead thinking about it as people deserve to use the languages that they prefer to use.
Thank you. Any thoughts? Diego?
No, just continue working together on expanding languages, on really continue to make sure that every community across the state of California has the same access to resources, right? Because if we're not investing in language access, I believe that we're not giving our communities a chance to have their voices heard. And if we are not doing it, who are perhaps leading the way from the research perspective, from the leadership perspective, which I see in this room, I don't know who else is going to do it. So let's work together on this and reach out if you want to just talk about it.
And Diego, your research shows real turnout gains when it comes to Section 203. When someone says, if turnout's low, why invest here? How do we reframe that so folks in this room can make a case for equal access that's a lasting investment?
Rephrase that question for me, because I feel like there's a lot of people who often think that minority groups are not just minority groups, groups in general, like Asian Americans or Latinos, do not turn out to vote. But this is why, one of the reasons why we built this analysis, right? We use a voter file. We get to actually see in a more granular way how many votes were cast in 2020 on Section 203 counties. And my report really shows that Section 203 counties have positive turnout gains. That's what I can say about it.
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about with my hometown of Watsonville, but we have historical low turnout compared to the rest of the county in Santa Cruz, and often feel like the response is, well, turnout's low, why invest here? And your research shows that you can see improvements when it comes to turnout.
Yeah. And if I may very quickly, so perhaps the smaller effects that I show on my slide is the 3.4 percentage points in increase change in turnout for Latinos. And we got to remember here that when we think about these razor-thin elections, okay, that could be decided with just a handful of votes, that 3 percentage points increase in turnout makes a huge difference. That's something that I really want to emphasize today. So Section 203 is impactful. Can we or should we continue doing work in California? Yes, maybe we should.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on?
Well, I think one of the things, and you raised this, in terms of Watsonville, and I just want to continue to reemphasize this, that there's a misunderstanding, I think, in the scholarly research, but also as applied, in that states like California and Texas, which have statewide mandates, have full coverage. And we know that that's not the case. There's lots of pockets across California that do not have full voter guides, voter pamphlets, Spanish ballots. Lots of places. And we have 14201 here in California, which extends that down to the precinct level with facsimile ballots. But in a state like California, and I think this goes to Anar's point of not saying, who is in, quote, need. In a state like California, where the Latino community is the largest racial ethnic population in the state, and the largest growing electorate, there should not be places where U.S. citizens whose first language is Spanish cannot get voting materials in their language. There should not be one county or city. And I think Diego's research documents that when you have it, your turnout goes up. And if you saw his findings for immigrants, it went up by almost 20 points, right? So when you highlight who's actually probably using this, their turnout is going up dramatically. And we really need to turn the corner on what is, was an important but outdated coverage formula that the federal government gave us and has not been updated, as Anar and I both pointed out, since 1992. The formula has not been updated since 1992 on who gets ballots in their language. And the communities are so much more spread out. We have to do a better job because we know it works. We have to do a better job of taking those ballots to these folks. These are US citizens who are registered and trying to vote in elections. It should not be controversial. They should get the ballot in their language.
Do you want to add?
Can I add something about the sort of I don't know, devil's advocate point of low voter turnout? I think the issue of turnout also begs the question of whether the responsibility of access to voting is on voters or on the institutions that are responsible for ensuring that people have access to basic rights and services. And so I think the voter turnout is low is a red herring for the absence of other kinds of support and infrastructure that is required for folks to really be able to not just access, but to be able to like robustly engage with those systems. And so I don't think it's just, a big part of it is that the turnout increases when you make these systems available. And another part of it is that it's not just the responsibility of voters to go, that if you vote, then you get more rights and services. It is that those rights and services are ones that all people who live in what is now the United States deserve, regardless of whether or not they meet, certain metrics.
Thank you. And we're going to do a closing round, which is, I know today we're celebrating 50 years of Section 203, but celebration is not the same as completion. And in one sentence, what's the next step that we must take to make our democracy truly inclusive? We'll start with Diego. Go down to Diego.
One sentence only?
I'll give you 1 minute max.
I think I said it already. Just work together, continue exploring the effects of Section 203 and other state local acts, right? Let's continue to be curious about how we can empower our immigrant communities and just our communities in general in California. So let's continue working together.
I have said a lot, but I think as we move towards fulfilling Section 203 in a greater way, I think attending to the gaps or other areas where we can focus our attention, including who may be getting left out and what impacts can we consider beyond turnout.
Also, I'll close by saying, if the federal government is not going to revise these standards, it's up to us to work with the states. We have an opportunity here in California. There's been an effort that folks like Pedro and Jonathan and others have been leading, and we can't give up on that. California can do a lot better. Texas can do a lot better. Florida, New York, Illinois. Let's go to the state legislatures, and if they won't, let's go to the counties and go to friendly county commissions and ask them to expand it, because I think I agree with Mark. We have to lower the threshold. We have to add more languages to who's covered under bilingual ballots.
Thank you, Matt, Anar, Diego, for grounding us in this history and this data. As we leave this panel and step into the rest of today's program, I invite you all to think about our role in carrying Section 203 forward and how we want to hold ourselves in the state accountable for it, and how we make sure the next 50 years don't just preserve this promise, but actually fulfill it. So on behalf of Common Cause and our planners, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It'll be a few minutes that
So in this moment in our national politics, with our democracy under attack and with immigrants under attack, the work we are doing here today together is right at that intersection. And there's no better place to examine how Section 203 does or doesn't act as a firewall than in California, where we have more immigrant voters than any other state. Today, in this panel, we're going to be using California as a Section 203 test case to to talk about where it's working, but also, as Anar and others on the last panel highlighted, where it's leaving communities out. I want to take a second and reflect on my personal experience. I've done language access work for the last decade or so, and Anar in the last panel mentioned linguistic complexity and the diversity within our own communities. When I started as the voting rights head at Asian Law Caucus, at this point almost 10 years ago, I realized that under California state law, which mandates certain limited translated reference ballots that we call facsimile ballots here in California, that across the Central Valley there were Hindi facsimile ballots being provided because the Indian community was large enough that it hit the state law thresholds. And as someone who's South Asian myself, I knew from my own experience and probably my family experience and my social experience growing up in California that there were no Hindi speakers. There are some Hindi speakers in the Central Valley, but the predominant Indian community is Punjabi speaking, right? There's a rich history of Punjabi immigration from the South Asian continent to California's Central Valley. And I looked into it, and what I realized was that the Secretary of State or elections officials, I think the Secretary of State at the time, knew that Asian Indian was hit, and they needed to identify a language to provide. And they had Southern California-based staff who asked Southern California-based advocates, what are the primary languages spoken by the Indian community? And those were Hindi speakers, and they said Hindi. And so across California, there were Hindi facsimile ballots, even when the community couldn't read them and couldn't do so. And so even in a state where we had passed state law language access, and we had resourced elections officials to use it, we still weren't meeting the needs of our communities. And so it's just a testament to the fact that we need vigilance, we need resources, and we need representation in our own work as advocates to make sure that we can see the communities that are most in need. And so today, to talk about that topic further, I'm thrilled to introduce you three experts in California. First up will be Dr. Mindy Romero, who's probably known to everyone in this room from the Golden State. She's the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. She's also a professor at USC and effectively California's leading researcher and academic on our electorate in our democracy. Her research has been cited in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Sacramento Bee, Politico, and elsewhere. Next up would be Deanna Kitsumura, the dearly beloved Deanna Kitsumura, who runs the voting rights program at Asian Law Caucus today. She spent 6 months helping us plan this event and is now feeling ill, so she's not with us. And Pedro Hernandez, the legal and policy director at California Common Cause, is going to step in and give Deanna's presentation for her. Pedro has been a longtime leader on language access and is the chair or co-chair of California's statewide language access advisory committee, which advises the Secretary of State on how to meet the language needs of our communities. And then third today is Ronald Saqib, who is the founder and executive director of the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, PANA, a leading San Diego organization that serves as a research, public policy, and community organizing hub dedicated to advancing full civic inclusion of refugees. Ronald's commitment to working in service and in community with refugee communities stems from her own refugee experience. Ronald was born in Somalia and came to the United States as a young child. Thank you to the three of you for your presentations, highlighting different parts of this puzzle. We have some questions after folks' presentations, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Mindy, over to you.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? Oh, there we go. Hi. Thanks very much, first off, for having me today, including me in this event. I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and I'm going to give us an overview of some voter participation gaps in California, those that we saw in the 2024 general election, but of course noting that this is nothing new. These gaps continue, but I'll talk about in what ways. So jumping in, the research that I'm going to share with you today comes directly from a brand new research report from my center, the Center for Inclusive Democracy. If you're interested, you can get it off the QR code that takes you to our publication page, and it's the second one on our publication page. And I welcome you to look around and see if there's other research that's of interest as well. This research was made possible by a Haas Junior Fund, and I set of recordings available because almost every time I give a presentation these days, there's a recording, but today's event is also being recorded. So thank you, Haas Junior Fund. All right, so first off, research requires inclusive and reliable data, and we have significant barriers and challenges to providing research in this state that is inclusive of the diversity and reflective of the diversity of the state. So I'm not going to get into all the detail here, although I'm happy to answer questions from many of you offline later, of course. Many of you have heard me talk about this, but there are two main data sources that are available that people use, that researchers use to identify voter turnout specifically. There's the current population survey, which is a product of the US Census. That is a survey, and it has limitations, a number of them, but one in particular, because it's just 50,000 for the whole United States, and when you want to get down to a sub-state level and look at California's, many communities, counties, and below county level, the data, for the most part, depending on what you're doing, is not usable. Then there's California voter file, and all 22 million or so registered voters. In using that, you can get down to the neighborhood level, right, precinct and so forth. But we have very limited information on people's race or ethnicity. So we are a volunteer state, which means when you register to vote, you have the ability to volunteer your race or ethnicity, your self-identified race or ethnicity, and overwhelmingly so, the overwhelming majority of the voter file of the 22 million registered voters that have not actually identified their race or ethnicity. It's a small proportion. And so when we're trying to do statewide analysis, as researchers, we have to go by other methods to try to identify at least the probability of somebody's race or ethnicity. I'm not going to get into depth, but just know that that means that the data that I'm going to show you today, and what many researchers, really all researchers in California, the research you see is limited in a number of groups, and particularly the subgroups that we're able to present to you at least accurately and reliably. We want to make sure, of course, that that research is usable and accurate. All right, so California is a limited set of voter turnout research, right? And a multiracial democracy requires inclusive data. So moving to the 2024 voter turnout, this is of course a general election. Bottom line, participation in our democracy in terms of voting, right, at least, continues to be low and disparate. The best we see in terms of turnout is a presidential general election. In the last couple of them, we've seen higher turnout than normal. I'll talk about that in a moment. But when we compare even those turnout rates to other established democracies around the world, it's low. And then, of course, if you look at midterms or primaries or special elections, very low. And no matter what you're looking at in terms of the type of election, or whether it's high turnout or low turnout, we know that there are going to be disparities, significant differences in turnout within the voting electorate. So by race, ethnicity, age, income, pretty much you name it, we'll continue. So what was voter turnout in our general election last November? And here I'm going to ask you just to think about it for a moment. And what I'm getting at here in the type of turnout is specifically eligible voter turnout. So that's the percentage of those who are eligible, adult citizens who actually voted. Anybody really quickly want to give me a number on eligible turnout? 30%. That's a really pessimistic number. 55? And you should have read the report, so I'm just... 60? Okay, if I had prizes, you would be the closest. 62%. So if you're starting at 30, maybe you think 62% is pretty good. Depends on your expectations too, right? In all of this, very much so. So 62%. There are two ways commonly that we see turnout measured. One is eligible, again, percentage of the adult population, adult citizen population. And then there's registered, which is the percentage of those who are registered to vote. So it's a smaller denominator, so it's always higher, right? Because it's those that are eligible and registered. Make sense? Okay. So if we want to compare 2024 to 2020, you probably all heard, or many of you, that nationally 2020 we saw a record eligible turnout rate, right? And in California, we didn't make a record, but according to Secretary of State, we had the highest eligible turnout in decades. So 2020 was a good year, comparatively speaking. Again, much lower than other nations. I would argue not where we want to be, where we want to end up. But there was a decrease, 10 percentage point decrease in registered voter turnout from 2020 to 2024 general, so 80 to 70. And then by our measure, about almost 5 percentage point decline in eligible voter turnout rate, again, between those two elections. If you look at the Secretary of State, their numbers are a little bit different. I can talk about in the Q&A why that is, but we say 5 percentage point decline. And not only did everybody decline, every group, but those of color and young people declined at a larger rate. So the participation gaps, right, turnout gaps widened. I will show you registered turnout here for a moment. We always emphasize wherever possible, depending on the analysis that you're doing, to try to look at eligible voter turnout because we have disparities, for instance, in registration rates to start. But when we look at registered, we are able to look at more groups. So here, remember I said everybody had a 10 percentage point decline from 2020 to 2024? Whites, 5.6. Latino, almost 13 percentage point decline. Black, 8.2. Asian American, 12.8. So higher, much higher, right, for voters of color here. And again, we're not able to break it out by subgroup, unfortunately. Eligible voter turnout, here we're more limited in the groups that I can accurately, responsibly share with you, but I have data for Latino and Asian American. Again, everybody was 4.8, remember? 4.8 also for Asian American. Again, difference between eligible turnout in those two elections, and then 7.6 for Latino. Even though we don't report white and black for eligible voter turnout, I can tell you that it was less for whites and more for blacks in terms of that decline. Make sense? Similar to what you saw in registered voter turnout. Language preference, so here we have to look at registered voter turnout. We don't have the denominators. But I don't think it's actually noted today that in California, people that we registered to vote, you were able to give your preference, right? Choose your language materials in the language that you want. If you don't make a choice, default is English. This is not a fully representative population because, as I'm sure many of you know, a lot of people don't even realize when they register that they can select, right, a choice other than English. So awareness and outreach and education around this is absolutely key. But for those that have registered, for that subpopulation with a language preference, you can see registered turnout for English, right, which is by far the dominant, 70.7, pretty similar to the overall registered voter turnout rate that I told you a moment ago at 70. But much lower from Chinese, right, to Thai and Vietnamese. Every group here that we're showing you is much lower registered voter turnout. And if you're curious, also experienced those that registered in a language other than English or have registered in a language other than English saw a larger decline also from 2020 to 2024 versus those that were registered with their materials being in English or having selected their preference being English. Make sense? Okay. And then just a couple more slides here. I just want to emphasize again, participation gaps widened in 2024. Everybody declined greater for voters of color and young people. Didn't show you slides on young people. And of course, there are consequences for policy and outcomes, which all of you know this. Why so low? Well, just to plate this, because I don't have time in the presentation, but I just always want to emphasize when I give numbers like this, and I know nobody in this room would do this, but the takeaway is not to say, as so many try to do, that there's something about that groups that have lower turnout is really about apathy, right? Or not caring. There's something deficient in the group themselves, right? Basically, blame the group narrative is what we hear. No, there were real significant barriers still in place in our registration and voting process that produce these disparities, right? And I like the emphasis earlier that somebody noted that, we think about placing the burden on the person, but what about the burden on our electoral system, right? So disparities in registration, disparities significantly fell in outreach and mobilization by the candidates and campaigns that use likely voter models that leave out whole swaths of even the registered electorate, historic and current disconnection, demographics, and so forth. And that's it. Thank you very much. And that wasn't the completeness.
And thank you, and I will pretend to be Tanner. I'll do my best. I'll start off with an overview of some data showing the limited English proficiency by ethnicity in California. Here you see very different levels of English proficiency among the population. And I will start off with the overview of Section 203 as well as an overview of state language requirements, state language access requirements. Under Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, it is a kind of, you may be familiar, but I will go over it. Mandates that certain translated election materials be produced if certain population thresholds are met. This is 5% of the citizen voting age population or 10,000 individual or citizens that are limited English proficient. And it requires that all voting material be translated. This includes the voter information guide, registration forms, signage, and so on. And bilingual poll workers are also required under this. And when we talk about this, we sometimes refer to this as like comprehensive language access, because it is, A to Z, wraparound service, and everything that's produced in English is also translated. Who is covered? I went over some of this, but it's citizens who are limited English proficient, and means that on the census form they did not indicate that they speak English better than well. And the rate is above the national average, less than 5th grade level. And it covers 4 groups. In 1975, when Section 203 was enacted, it only covered 4 language communities: Hispanic, Native American, Alaskan Native, and which one did I say? Hispanic and Asian, right? So those are the 4. And there was a lot of, the webinar that we had the other week went over a lot of the kind of evidence that was supplemented to make this happen, but so I won't go into that. But yes, the census does revisit these numbers every 5 years, or the DOJ puts out the data every 5 years, and the determination to release every 5 years. And Section 203 is up for reauthorization in 2032. And there's no guarantee that we will get that. It was a struggle to have that done last time, if you watched the webinar. Section 203 coverage in California. There are 28 counties covered for Section 203. Spanish and Chinese are the 2 most frequently covered languages. You can see that, despite kind of folks thinking that Spanish is covered under 203 for the entire state, that's not the case. In fact, you see many counties uncovered for Spanish in California. California has its own language access regime or protections. And there's a great set of papers on the Language Access Summit if you really want to go into the details of sort of the legislature's intent and where advocates were at that time that we passed for Section 14201. Check it out, it's really interesting. But California requires that counties offer translated reference ballots. These are known as facsimile ballots. Raise your hand if you remember a fax machine. I do. All right, so that's what it's named after. And that kind of gives you a sense of how long we've had this form of language assistance in our state. Voters can use these as guides, but cannot actually vote for them. So you can get one in the mail. Mine comes in yellow, and my family can kind of hold them side by side. That's how voters engage with facsimile materials, or unless a county provides a composite ballot, that's another thing. But they must be conspicuously posted and available as loose leaf when you go in person to the vote center or your local polling location. And that means that they have to be posted on the wall. And you should be able to take a copy with you to the poll so you can vote in private. Yes, I've gone over some of this. Precinct-specific reference ballots must be available. So that means, like, I live in precinct number 4501 in my county, which means, maybe I get, I don't get, well, I get, whatever city district I'm in and whatever county I'm in, all of those ballots, all of those contests have to be listed on my ballot. So I'm supposed to be able to get a precinct-specific translated ballot, sample ballot for me to reference that includes all of the contests. And vote centers, they have to be available at vote centers as well. So in California, we have the Voter Choice Act. these facsimile ballots are available in these vote centers, and counties must also mail these to voters that have a language preference on file. Who is covered? And state law has a smaller threshold than federal law, but the scope of services is different. I'll say that it's 3% of adults in a precinct who are limited English proficient. An appellate court in 2019 limited the language groups to those that are required under federal law. So for some time, the advocates wanted to include Arabic and Somali as kind of languages covered under 14201. A 2019 court decision narrowed the scope of what languages are available to the same or under federal law. However, the Secretary of State does have the power to find a need if there is sufficient reason to believe that the need exists. And the Secretary of State makes these language access determinations for facsimile ballots, sample ballots, every 4 years. And the next one is due January 1st, 2026. California also requires that bilingual poll workers be available in certain precincts. It's 3% of citizen voting age population. And at vote centers under the BCA, an interpreter must be available at each vote center. There are 52 counties in California out of 58 where at least one precinct is covered under state law. And the most frequently covered languages include Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Punjabi. There have been attempts to expand language access in California. Recently, AB 884, its co-sponsors included Asian Law, Caucus, California Common Cause, and PANA. It would have codified a version of Section 203 without language limitations, so it would have expanded beyond the 4 language categories and would have used voting age instead of citizen voting age as its sort of denominator for the 10,000 or 5%. It required translated ballots instead of reference ballots for smaller language groups. Those under state law, it would have just said, instead of facsimile ballots, we provide in-language votable ballots. It was passed through the legislature with bipartisan support, however, vetoed by the governor. SB 266, its co-sponsors came back, tried to listen to the governor's veto message and pared back the bill, didn't include the voter information guide. It would have required translated ballots and the signature cure form for smaller groups. However, the bill was held in the Appropriations Committee. We have 2 reports out. They're both on your table. One of them just came out today. It's called Forging Ahead, Community Voices and the Impact of Language Access in the Electoral Process. And Breaking Barriers, our report from, I don't know, it's been 2.5 years? 3 years?
2023.
2023, thank you. And please check out Democracy in Action. It's our poll observer findings released November 2024. It was a joint California Common Cause and Asian Law Caucus report, and some of the authors are here in this room, and you can find out. We'll make this slide deck available online so folks can get access to this. Is there another slide after this? Oh, this is Deanna's contact information if you want it.
Can you guys hear me okay?
No,
if I talk.
pull that mic.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
hold it close.
I thought you did a great job being Deanna. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you for that overview of Section 203. My name is Ramla. I'm the Executive Director. PANA is a grassroots organization in San Diego. We advocate for the full economic, civic inclusion of refugees and displaced populations in the San Diego region, throughout California and across the country. And we envision a world where refugees and displaced people are connected leaders building a movement, global movement, that ends forced migration and secures meaningful freedom for all. So power building, being part of the vote, that's very important for our communities if we want to see a future and a world, right, that respects our values and supports the priorities of our families. Like Pedro went over, Section 203's definition of language minority completely leaves out our African and MENA languages from coverage. Additionally, both state and federal law rely on census data that visibilizes our community and relies on threshold data that are difficult and inconsistent when trying to apply them to communities. And even as Mindy mentioned, when you're registering to vote, for example, and you have the option to kind of write in you can write in your language, but there's also an option to say you're foreign born and from which country. In San Diego, when I try to register our community, Somalia isn't even listed, right? So there are countries that are just completely unrecognized or even missing from the ballot. And these are not insignificant communities. I mean, if you look at their numbers, and these are what we can pull from population data. But we know that there's a huge undercount of our communities, and there isn't really a reliable way to understand like the size. I would also argue that in San Diego, for example, the Somali population in the early 2000s definitely met the Section 203 federal threshold data, but because our community, so we were in violation, right? And not in compliance with Section 203. But because the community is invisibilized in the data, the onus is on the community to really fight. And there's a lot of discretion with election administrators. So the challenges are just too difficult for communities to overcome. And I know too many of our communities as well who simply write in English because it's a norm and a standard that their language communities aren't even available. So it doesn't make sense for some of our folks to write in Somali or Oromo or Amharic or Tigrinya, right? Or even Swahili, if you know it's not gonna be provided. So I'm just gonna write in English. And not having things in their language is just that reality. So we kind of rely on data sets to tell us how many Somali people or other African communities might be in our communities. And for our communities, being an LEP voters means you are often relying on your children, friends, neighbors to get voter information and to vote. It also simply means that they sometimes are most likely not. In a listening session with Arab speakers in 2022, someone said, some don't even vote at all, even though they're eligible due to language barriers. And personally speaking, my mom, for example, would not be voting if it's not for me. And she knows where to find me. She's very good at voting. High schooler shared that her grandmother, who is a US citizen for 20 years, is active in the community. So this is someone who invests in community, like she's turning out for community workshops, actions, she's volunteering, she's helping others. But she doesn't vote because she worries about bothering other family members for help. And in San Diego, we were able to work with our county board and ROV to get reference materials, so the facsimile ballots that Pedro had just mentioned in Arabic and Somali. During the last election, we conducted a post-poll interview with folks. While we hoped it would help LEP voters, instead they shared the challenges of trying to work with a copy at a small desk and having to flip through what felt like hundreds of pages to find their reference ballot. And to compare it with their English version so they can vote. It was clunky, people felt exposed, and it was not easy. Another shared that they didn't even realize that there were reference ballots available in their language. So when you know and expect not to be served or not have information in your language, you don't even ask, right? So some, for that reason, just didn't know that it was available. These are the challenges that keep people from voting and participating in our democracy. But these challenges can be overcome. Others have done it and we can too. In 2022, Dearborn, Michigan essentially passed its own Section 203, inclusive of all languages spoken by at least 5% of the city's population or 10,000 residents. They did not have to mess around with translated reference ballots. Under the city law, they provided votable ballots in Arabic since 2022. Like the experiences we reported from our interviews and what we heard in our listening sessions, We have to make voting easy. There's so many barriers to get people to the polls that once they arrive, they shouldn't be felt othered or exposed in that space. So how many of you go into spaces where you're uncomfortable? How likely are you to participate? No. Either you simply walk out or you don't go at all, right? So voting shouldn't, get in the way of people feeling like they belong in our democracy. A quote from one of the participants in Michigan said, "I felt like I was home when I voted in Adam." So what can we do? So there's statewide policies that we can pass, but that others in California, but others as well. So we can codify Section 203 in state law, but redefine language minority as any group speaking a language other than English. So that's the Dearborn example. And this would largely benefit immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, Haiti, and other communities not currently eligible that are large enough and concentrated enough to meet Section 203 has high thresholds. And I recognize, the limitations of Section 203 from the previous panel as well, that the thresholds they're just too high sometimes. We can codify and redefine language minority and mandate use of alternative data sources. So this is a good way to get around some of the high thresholds. You can use school data, you can use hospital data. ASHPED, the Office of Statewide Health Planning, has really good data on languages because in medical care settings, right? Language is really important, making sure people understand their care. So that's like a data set that can be very reliable. And beneficiaries are the same as above, plus all communities undercounted by the census. We can codify Section 203 to define language minority and lower thresholds, like 3% instead of 5%. Beneficiaries do include, all the same groups: African, Middle Eastern, Haiti, and those not currently eligible, and communities not large enough or concentrated enough to meet Section 203's high threshold. Excuse me. We can also we can be creative. We don't have to stick to the same paradigms, right? We can create alternative pathways for coverage. Let's make the case that let communities make the case, county by county, to election officials or to SOS using clear standards, processes defined by the SOS. So what if we had just a simple process where a community can follow that required then the SOS to then respond by a certain timeline? Giving that community a chance at being recognized and having materials in their language. Communities, all communities would benefit from that, especially communities that are really close and near what we consider near misses. In California specifically, in Section 14201 determinations, the Secretary of State can use her discretion to adopt an inclusive definition of language minority. California uses the federal definition, and that's by discretion. It's not mandated, and it's our choice, really. So this was blessed by the courts in Advancing Justice versus Dia. So this is something that we all have to be educating our SOS on and advocating on. Is like, again, we can use our discretion to expand access to more people and include all languages. I will end with that. I don't think it was too fast.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much for that. If you can go to that next slide, this is something that Deanna wanted to feature. So there's sometimes a conversation when we're fighting for language access, and it centers around the question, do folks really want that? Or will folks actually use that? And there is at least some pushback that, from that place of skepticism. And so Deanna provided us with data that surveyed limited English speakers about the helpfulness of translated votable ballots. And you can see the overwhelming majority of folks found to be either essential or very helpful. And there was recent data that came out. We partnered with Haas Junior Fund and a number of others to develop a poll with the Berkeley Institute for Governmental Studies that came out, I believe, earlier this year. And it asked people who chose to take the poll in a language other than English. So these are registered voters who prefer a language other than English. It asked them two questions. If there was a ballot available in your language, would you be more likely to vote? And if there was a ballot available in your language, would you find it easier to vote? And the answer was 86% yes and 87% yes. So we've been able to document through surveys of the English-speaking voters that if they have these materials available to them, they want them, they will use them, and they will vote more often. I mean, that's underlined by all the data from the earlier panel from Diego and others showing the real-world impact of increasing Section 203 coverage. Okay, so I want to just ask one question of the panel, and then we're going to create time for conversation and questions from the audience. And Megan, do you have, will you all be running a microphone to people with questions? Yeah, perfect, okay. So the question I have for the team, given the poor, for the panel, Pedro, Ramla, Mindy, given the poor track record of facsimile ballots, Ramla, you mentioned this, oftentimes people don't know they exist. If they do know they exist, they can't find them. When they can find them, they have to juggle them with their votable ballots in the language they don't speak. Given the poor track record of facsimile ballots, given the documented effectiveness of votable translated ballots, you know, looking at the policy solutions that you identified, if all of you could name one reform that would push California forward or that states can adopt, what would you lead with?
I would get rid of thresholds.
Get rid of
I
thresholds.
would get rid of thresholds. I think communities know themselves the best. There are communities who could be considered like a threshold language, but may not require votable ballots in that language, right? But there might be language minorities who want to vote and can make a difference, right? You know, there's this repeated line about elections being razor thin, and we all know that we benefit when all people participate in our democracy. So what if we allowed communities, right, the right to just ask?
Right, so build a new paradigm, not tied to the thresholds that allows us to build a multilingual democracy. Great. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we focused on SB 266 on the translated ballot, so we knew that that was
SB 266 was, just repeat it for everyone.
it was a bill in the California legislature last year that would have provided for in-language ballots to languages covered under 14201 and expanded the categories of languages that would be covered under state law. So an in-language ballot we see as kind of central in having access to that for these communities instead of having to compare to documents or going to the voting place to have access to posted facsimile ballots and loose leaf facsimile ballots. I think would be a huge improvement because people could vote from home and have their ballot in a private setting to be able to read these ballot language questions. I mean, we have a ballot measure coming this November that I think is going to be quite confusing to a lot of voters. And I think it's really important that we, I think that's going to be a very interesting case to see, like, do voters understand what government is asking them to do with this?
So I would say, in addition to all of that, just a greater recognition of the importance of both implementation, has already been noted today, and outreach, and funding for both of those things, which is really the key element here. We know from the collective research, we're beginning to weave now a really good understanding of the interconnected nature of not only the importance of providing in-language materials and language assistance, right, from the registrar level, but that implementation is key, training is key, having bilingual poll workers trained, but also the partnerships, right, that should be happening when we see them happen. We know how powerful they are with community-based organizations. And that all of that, right, means that an individual voter who needs language assistance not only is getting those materials, but they're also, in that same process, being encouraged to vote, right? And especially with trusted messages from the community too, they are being asked to participate. They're being told that their vote actually matters in a sincere way, right? We have these materials, we have this assistance, this is really available to you, and we want you to participate and be part of our greater electorate, right, and to have a voice. So I think all of those together are just crucially important. And I think Matt mentioned earlier too, the importance of as much as it can be understood and there can be a connection, what are campaigns and candidates doing and not doing, as we just recognizing the fact that the overwhelming majority of outreach is done by campaigns and candidates, and they have their own purposes, right, obviously, in terms of the election, getting their candidate or their issue passed. But how much can that also be brought in, just because it's such a huge component, and often that's a barrier that people have. What can be done to kind of understand or connect to that in nonpartisan ways, but just make sure that that's kind of part of the discussion and the strategy. So, yeah, implementation, outreach in a broad definition, and money.
Thank you so much. Okay, questions from the audience. I see Dora up here. Megan, can you raise your hand for us? Megan has the microphone. So we have one question here, and then we'll go there second. Right here. And do us all there, introduce yourself and who you're with.
Hi, I'm Dora Rose, I'm Deputy Director of Legal Resources California. Thank you so much for having this, and thank you so much for doing this research. This is, we made a lot of progress in terms of voting reforms in California. This is one of those things that we have not made sufficient progress on, right? It is a key element of full enfranchisement and suffrage, and we are absolutely one with you on efforts to try to ameliorate this problem. We need votable ballots, we need more language. It feeds into our problem of underrepresentation, which we have a significant problem. That is California's key democracy problem, right? We have a very large portion of our communities of color who are underrepresented in the electorate. So, my question is, it seems to me that the biggest stumbling block in the bills that we've tried to support it and tried to float in this area is funding. Everyone has a good heart, everyone would like to see this happen, but we can't get it past the legislature because it keeps getting caught up in the money issue. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts as to how creatively we might be able to penetrate that problem together as a voting rights community.
I mean, how big of a priority are we making this? I think is a really great question for the state. How much do we value the diversity that we have in the state? And when we have, and I'm really grateful for the clerks and the election officials who've been able to share how much these things would cost. And in some cases, it's for some counties, because maybe they have their own printer, it's not as much, and maybe for other counties, it's not as much. And there are some ideas being floated around about how do we kind of look at democracy in California, and I think those are important questions to explore. But I do think figuring out a way to have the state fund some of these state mandates around translations needs to be addressed. And I don't know if it's like a different formula for coverage and county, smaller counties get a larger percentage and then larger counties and so on. There's some ideas I think that we need to kind of explore. I know that on policy, the clerks, at least the ones I've been able to speak with, have been, wanting to continue the conversation because it seems like we are identifying a pathway that could work. But I do think that we need to kind of have the legislature prioritize what it looks like and how much these things are actually going to cost. And also we need a little bit of honesty about how much it will actually cost, because sometimes I feel like we get estimates that are just a way to kind of distract us from actually getting stuff done.
Heather, before we leave you, is there anything you said about modernized voting machines that have more language functionalities that might enable us to add new languages at a lower cost?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the vendors right now are making Arabic language ballots available in Michigan, but they haven't done it here for San Diego. Why? Because counties can pay them to certify it, and there's an incentive for costs. We know that the HARP machine comes with 19 languages programmed and like an additional 13 or so. So we have language capabilities in the actual machines providing language ballots. It's a matter of printing. and the actual translations. And I do think that we haven't seen the Secretary of State of ESTA certify kind of language access capabilities in a clearer way, which I've appreciated over the last 2 or 3 years, but I do think that we need to kind of revisit some of that certification process to kind of make it easier for, LA system to upgrade additional languages when language determinations come out and not make it too expensive to actually certify for language access. I think that should be a priority as well.
Should we go to our next question? Anyone want to weigh in? Anybody further?
I mean, just that, like, yeah, I agree, like Jonathan, as our technologies get more advanced, I think it'll be easier and less expensive to provide language access. And the reality is, like, languages like Arabic, like, use a different script, and like, that might be a reason why someone says, but Somali is a Latin script, right? There's no reason why we couldn't provide it. So, like, I think there are definitely barriers that are in the way that are not real. So it's like eliminating kind of, or in deciphering what's true or what's assumed, and it's not actually true. And then providing more of the materials online. Like, we don't need to print everything, but if it's on the website and people can find valid information on the website and can print it themselves, there are ways that we can create access.
I'll just add something. So I'm a researcher, so of course I'm going to say something along the lines of more research, which means, by the way, addressing again the limitations of the data so we can have better, more inclusive research. But I also think that, maybe just recognizing that, and all of you that work in the field know this much more than me, but when you're out there making the case, whether you're a ledge member or staff member or a media person or whatever it might be, I think there's still a lot of people coming from the perspective, they don't have the numbers, just pure population numbers, and they think this is really small, right? And we're talking about priorities, we're talking about money, we're talking about priorities. Sorry, Dora, I was looking at you. And so just educating on the sheer size, although it shouldn't just be about size, because every vote matters, right? But educating just in terms of the descriptive numbers, the pure size of the communities that we're talking about right here in our wonderful state, our communities, but also, I think, sadly so, recognizing also that in addition to all of that, there are a lot of people that don't think that this should be a priority. And I hate to be the person that says that today, but just knowing that there's a case to be made fiscally and policy-wise, but when we're talking about allies in our greater state, many people, it's a sell, and there are people that we may think that in conversations at large are hearing and listening, but maybe they're not actually agreeing. And I think just greater recognition of that in terms of understanding the hill decline. Sorry, Jonathan, one reason why it's important to recognize that more is that maybe then funders and other supporters, right, that can bring the money and help with the prioritization and the narrative might come to the table with really recognizing how the full extent of the barriers that are in place. Does that make sense? Okay.
Totally, and I'll just add one sentence, which is that we've been hearing all year about how it's a catastrophic budget environment for California, and suddenly we're going to spend $200 million on a special election in November, and setting aside the validity and usefulness of that special election, we can find money for things we care about in this state. We've done it over and over and over.
And our panelists today are Evelyn, Director of Democracy at Demos, and Ami Gandhi, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Midwest Voting Rights Program.
At
Hello? Okay. Must have just died. Well, and so Phi Wen, Director of Democracy at Demos, and Ami Gandhi, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Midwest Voting Rights Program at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. And our planned third panelist isn't able to be with us today, but that just means we get a little extra time to hear from Phi and Ami and dig deeper into their rich experiences. So I'll start by inviting each of our panelists to share about their work and then I'll ask a couple of questions, and if time permits, we'll wrap up with audience Q&A. So our first panelist is Phi Nguyen, Director of Democracy at Demos. Phi joined Demos as Director of Democracy in October 2023, bringing years of grassroots organizing and legal advocacy experience. She previously served as Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, where she worked at the intersection of voting rights and immigrant justice to build power for Asian American, immigrant, and refugee communities in Georgia. At Advancing Justice Atlanta, Phi led impact litigation against voter suppression, including challenges to restrictive vote-by-mail laws, exact match vote purges, and unlawful limits on language access at the polls. She also helped establish the state's largest multilingual election protection program, combining poll monitoring with statewide voter hotline. And beyond the courts, we testified before the Georgia legislature and local election boards to defend voting rights and expand ballot access. Please welcome Phi. We're so excited to have her here today. So the question I have for you is, Phi, based on your research, how are states and local jurisdictions building on or going beyond federal Section 203 protections? And what national trends or challenges do you see shaping this landscape?
Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah, all right. Well, first of all, hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I want to actually first start us off with a map that we created at Demos, which shows where there's currently coverage for any language under Section 203. So the darker blue represents counties that currently have 203 coverage, while the smaller red dots indicate smaller political subdivisions, such as cities or Native American reservations that have a 203 coverage. I've included a QR code if you would like to access our language access resource page, which is still a work in progress, but that's where this map currently lives. And it is actually, what's cool about it is it's interactive. And so if you hover over either the red dots or the darker blue shaded spots, you can actually see which languages are covered and the thresholds, how they're covered, under which threshold of either the 10,000 raw number or the 5% threshold. So the reason why I wanted to start with this map, and I know y'all have already seen maps today, but the reason why I wanted to start with this map is because I do think it does a good job of illustrating that while Section 203 has certainly created language assistance for voters all across the country, there are far, far more jurisdictions where voters enjoy zero Section 203 protections at all. I know we've already picked on Georgia a little bit, but I will again offer my home state of Georgia as an example. So in Georgia, which is a state of about 11 million people, there's only one county in the entire state that is covered under Section 203, and that's Gwinnett County, and it is only covered for one language, which is Spanish. You heard a little bit about that earlier today from some of the other panelists. But the reason why I want to linger on this example a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper into it is I think Georgia is a good example of how important it is for local and state governments to tailor their policies to the unique characteristics of their specific geographies. And so there are two particular features of Georgia that together I think make it especially hard for any language community to get coverage under 203. First, we have massive urban sprawl, which I was just talking to somebody from California about on the break. And I know here and elsewhere, LA has a reputation for its sprawl, but LA actually scores rather well on its population density. Atlanta, on the other hand, does not. Among the 9 US metro areas with over 6 million people, Atlanta ranks at the very bottom in terms of population density. So that's number one. Number two, we have way too many counties. Does anybody who's not from Georgia know how many counties Georgia has? Yes, over 100. We have 159 counties. Which is more than any other state besides Texas, and it's obviously much smaller than Texas, right? We have more than twice as many counties as California, even though California is nearly 3 times the size of Georgia. And I don't know if how well you can see this map, but if you are looking from your phone, you can kind of just visually see how the counties in Georgia are so small as compared to the size of the counties in California and some of these other Western states. What that means in terms of potential 203 coverage is that Georgia's language communities are generally spread very thinly across several counties, which of course makes it much harder for any one language community to ever satisfy 203's population thresholds. And to just give a really concrete example of this, the metro Atlanta region is 6 million people, but it's spread across 11 counties. And you can compare that to LA County, which is bigger, it's 10 million people, but it's just cabined to one county. Does this just turn off when you're not using it? Oh, all right. So I did a little bit of math, and if the 11 counties that make up the metro Atlanta area were combined into just one county of 6 million people, then Vietnamese would get 203 coverage, and Chinese and Korean would get very close. And then of course Spanish, which is currently only covered in Gwinnett County, would be covered in all 11 counties that make up the metro Atlanta area. So I offer that example not just to pick on Atlanta and our lack of population density, but I offer that example because other than the fact that I don't think we're going to get any federal policy on language access anytime soon, local and state jurisdictions are actually really uniquely positioned to solve for the limitations of 203 by designing language access policies that are specifically tailored to the unique realities of their language communities, taking into account factors that of course includes population size, but also things like population density. And given the unique context of different states and localities, there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to building on 203 protections at the state or local level. But one thing, and this was talked about a little bit earlier, is one thing about local and state jurisdictions is they have a lot of flexibility in enacting language access policies that, unlike the federal DRA, can have a broader purpose rather than just remedying discrimination. Whenever we talk about expanding 203, then inevitably there's conversations about how to establish the congressional record to justify legally any expansion of 203. And local and state jurisdictions really do not have that limitation. So in terms of different state and local policies, they of course differ across a number of different factors, but most importantly, they differ across who gets covered and how they get covered. You heard a little bit already on one of the previous panels. I think Ramla sort of beautifully laid out some policy recommendations, and I wanted to dive into that a little bit. But if we focus this discussion on how local and state policies differ across how people get covered, then I would divide the existing policies into 3 major categories. So There's, of course, policies that just simply mirror Section 203 and codify 203 at the state level, but don't extend coverage beyond what's provided federally. And an example of this is the Virginia State VRA. And this was alluded to earlier, but we may not think of this as a transformative language access policy, but as we continue to see the Supreme Court gut the federal VRA, I do think that this type of policy has become more and more important. And in fact, I think there are states where there may not just be the political will to go beyond 203. So I think that this still offers a very solid policy for those states. And then there are the policies that use the core Section 203 framework with the different triggers, but expand coverage. And the primary way that these policies expand coverage is by expanding the definition of language minority to include language groups that are excluded from 203. You heard a lot about that this morning already. And then the other major way that state and local policies go beyond 203 is by lowering the population thresholds. We also have heard a lot about that today already as well. There are some other, I think, tweaks in policies that enable local and state jurisdictions to go beyond 203. Some ways that different policies do this is by basing the thresholds or benchmarks on a broader population than adult citizens, right? So in California, y'all do that. You use voting age population instead of citizens of voting age population. In Minnesota, their language access policy uses resident population, so doesn't even limit it to adults. The same is true with Oregon. And then there are policies like California that also layer in some discretion for the Secretary of State or relevant election official to also provide language access if there's a demonstrated need, even for populations that don't meet the threshold. And then the third type of language access policy that we see at the local and state level are ones that don't use mathematical formulas at all. And these policies can sometimes use a ranking system, or they might actually name the language community in the statute or ordinance. So for example, Oregon, their language access policy provides assistance to the top 5 most commonly spoken languages in the state, regardless of population size. And then Miami-Dade County has an ordinance that specifically provides assistance in Haitian Creole. Why is this not working? Oh, oops. Okay, so in terms of recent trends that we've seen in the language access world, one thing that we've seen happen over the last 5 years is state VRAs are really gaining momentum. And this, I think, is explained by the gutting of the federal VRA. And I know California has a state VRA, but that was passed a while ago, but these more recent VRAs tend to be much more robust in terms of tracking all of the various provisions of the federal VRA. So in the last 5 years, 5 states have passed state VRAs, and those states are Colorado, Connecticut, Minnesota, New York, and Virginia. And then there's a diversity of other states that have recently introduced state VRAs but have not yet passed them. And those include Alabama, Florida, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, and Texas. So you can really see that this trend is not just cabin to one particular region of the country. And I do want to uplift in particular the Connecticut VRA as an example of a VRA that really provides robust statewide language access, or at least has the ability to. I think it actually only currently covers Spanish, but that is because of the particular populations. But in terms of their coverage formula, it is one of the most expansive when you are comparing the different state VRAs and other language access policies at the state level. So the VRA, the Connecticut VRA has a numerical threshold of 4,000, and it lowers the percentage-based threshold to just 2%. And unlike the New York VRA, the Connecticut VRA doesn't have a minimum number of LDP adult citizens under the thresholds formula. And the Connecticut VRA also applies to language minorities who are excluded from the federal definition. The other thing that I think is worth uplifting about the Connecticut VRA is that once coverage is triggered, it also has a strong set of mandates that I would say are as expansive and wraparound as the federal VRA. So once coverage is triggered, it requires translations of all materials and information relating to elections, including ballots, and it also requires that whenever possible, language assistance should include live translation. And another thing that the Connecticut VRA does is it provides a private right of action for covered voters if jurisdictions are not meeting their requirements under the Connecticut VRA. And again, as the risk of the federal VRA and its protections, as the risk of that going away increases, then I think it's increasingly important that states also provide a private right of action under state law. And if folks are interested about learning more about the Connecticut VRA, we are actually working on a case study that we hope to publish very soon, so stay tuned for that. I doubt any of you can actually read this. I definitely cannot, but I just wanted to preview for you that on the language access website that we have created a couple of tables that show, one chart shows the state language access policies and statutes that expand coverage beyond federal VRA. So this is, I think this does actually need to be updated. I think we need to add Maryland to this, but this does not include any policies that simply mirror 203, but these are policies that actually go beyond it. And then we also, and there's only, I think, about 10 or 11 states. So there's a lot of work to still be done. And then we also have a chart that captures some of the local policies that are enacted either at the city level or the county level that expand coverage beyond 203. I can't promise that this is an exhaustive list because it's much harder to track legislation at the local level, but this offers us at least a sampling of some of the different policies that exist out there and what they cover and how coverage is sort of determined. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bea. That was wonderful, and I really appreciate the grounding in this moment when things are unpredictable and scary and chaotic at the federal level, what we can really do on the local level to advance, protect, and codify these rights. So before we move on to our next panelist, I would like to share a brief video featuring one of our community members who will talk about why in-language ballots are so important to her family. So our next panelist is Ami Gandhi. Ami is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Midwest Voting Rights Program at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She works to reduce barriers to voting and strengthen civic participation, particularly in communities of color and low-income communities across the Midwest. Ami has led statewide voter protection efforts during the 2016 and 2020 elections, partnered with community members in the criminal legal system to expand voter access, advocated for communities of color throughout Illinois' redistricting process, and advised election authorities on implementing the nation's first Hindi ballots. Her experience also includes litigating in Illinois and Indiana and collaborating with communities to draft and pass legislation. And I also just want to say that from my work in Chicago as a young organizer, I looked up to Ami very much and worked closely with Ami on several initiatives, and so I'm grateful to be able to invite you to be here today. So please welcome Ami.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, V and Fee, for your insights. And this has been a great program so far today. I'm learning a lot. I'm furiously taking notes that I'll take back to my Midwest-focused work. And while we're getting the presentation up, I just wanted to say a little bit about myself. Again, I'm Ami, and I work in Illinois and Indiana in particular. And one of the things I wanted you to know about me is, yes, I'm with a legal organization, and I love it, and also recognize that law is a highly imperfect tool to address our community's issues and barriers and opportunities. And so as far as I wanted you to have a little bit of a sense of the style with which Chicago Lawyers Committee comes to this, and it's really to avoid litigation, avoid even legal tools, I would say, when they're not needed, and to be guided by communities impacted by these issues, including language access issues and opportunities, in following their strategies to building power. And so you'll hear that in some of the stories that I'll share from my perspective, especially about opportunities on the county and local level to advance language resources. And so...
And so the question, yes, thank you, that I have for you is, how has county level advocacy pushed the envelope beyond Section 203 requirements, and what role do CBOs play in this advocacy, and what advice would you give to organizers elsewhere?
Thank you. And when, as Viveka mentioned, when we met each other and had the chance to work together initially, it was a job or two ago on my end when I had the opportunity to work more squarely in Asian American and South Asian communities. And I remember some of the voter protection work we did together at places like Devon Avenue neighborhood of Chicago. And those experiences really were significant for me in having an idea of how can these policies make a real life impact in our community members' experiences for voting, and when is it not necessarily helpful or not a priority worth shooting for. And I know that we've been talking about some of this today, so I won't stick on all of these points, but you all very well know from the local community efforts that you're a part of that the data that's used to devise the Section 203 calculations don't tell the whole story about the needs or the excitement for participation in our communities. One of the places where we saw that play out is a suburban part of Illinois, DuPage County, Illinois, that has many Spanish-speaking voters and many other language groups as well. But there was previously Section 203 required coverage in that county, and then beginning end of 2016, beginning of 2017, DuPage County was taken off of the list, and community members there knew that that was not right, that it's not that the needs went down or the population went down in their community. And there was a local election official who was willing to meet with several of our organizations in a coalition effort and to try to do what he could, provide some voluntary assistance, even when the county was taken off of the list for Section 203 coverage. But I have to say that my observation was that he faced some backlash at that point in providing that voluntary assistance. His agency was actually eliminated. I don't mean to sound too dramatic, but because language access was not the only reason for that. There were other local political factors, but that's seriously what happened. That the agency got eliminated, he lost his job. There's a current clerk now in that county. Now that county is back to having Spanish assistance per Section 203 requirements, but the current clerk faces some very regular, significant harassment by local political leaders, even by some community members who overinflate the occurrence of fraud, for example, and spread other misinformation about our community's voters. And so also we see in places like Chicago and Cook County, which have come up a couple times in the presentations today, where there is a lot of language access required under Section 203, and that's amazing. It's an amazing start, but it doesn't meet all the community's needs. For example, some of the organizations focused on Korean-speaking voters, Tagalog-speaking voters in our coalitions have long pushed for more coverage and more resources and have stepped up to provide some of that themselves. I'm sure that's not an easy decision and shouldn't have to be a burden that's on our community organizations and leaders, but that is the calculus that some of them have gone through. And working in collaboration with the communities who do have coverage, which in the case of Chicago and suburban Cook County includes coverage for Spanish, Hindi and other South Asian languages, and Chinese. And so I'm trying to give you a flavor of, even when there have been some advances in coverage, including at the federal level, there are still always going to be gaps, which I'm sure you all see in your work as well. And when they're first kicked in South Asian language access under Section 203 coverage in Illinois, it started in the city of Chicago and suburban Cook County around 2011. And some of you who have been involved with this work may have been there or heard about it, but the local election officials were really excited to try to follow the law and show that they were trying to do something about the legal requirements because of having faced liability for this in the past, this type of issue in the past. They held a huge press conference and invited the media outlets from our different communities and said, yes, we, as the law says, we will provide assistance in the Indian language. And of course, everyone laughed. And it was just total mockery because they hadn't done their homework to know what the implementation would look like. There were poor translations in those beginning days of the assistance to Indian and South Asian voting communities. I might make you laugh or cry with some of the examples of the translations back then, but thankfully the translations have gotten better, in part because of community members stepping up to improve the quality and to insist that the local governments expend the resources to improve the quality. And here I have a picture of one of our heroes in this work, Shobna Varma, who she was one of the first personnel for the city of Chicago's Board of Elections, and she was brought on specifically to do outreach and language resources for Hindi-speaking and other South Asian voters. And then she actually was initially assisting with language correction, and then the election board brought her on as a staff member, which I think was a really important advance in improving the quality of this sort of implementation. And I know I've heard other people, Anar and other people, mention these ideas throughout the day, which I totally agree with, as far as how well the community can be positioned to provide observations about how implementation is going and ideas for where to go from here. So I know I've been talking about federal law compliance a bit, but my point is our communities really are well served if we're hands-on about what the implementation looks like, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever kind of protection it may be. And there have been some challenges for sure. There have been instances of backtracking, not just the example I gave you of when a jurisdiction was literally taken off of a coverage list, but also more informal types of backtracking that has happened when there are staff transitions or election official transitions. And thankfully, through collective advocacy, and it's a huge collective effort in Illinois area work, certainly not my organization alone, we've been able to turn a lot of that around. There is a suburban Cook County additional protection beyond the federal floor that's called the Cook County Vote Ordinance that many of our organizations helped write and pass in 2019, and then it was amended and I would say strengthened and expanded some a couple years back. And it was spearheaded by a county commissioner who is trying to be accountable to Korean speaking and other community members in his district. And we collaborated with organizations like Asian Americans Advancing Justice, MALDEF, and others to try to make the county ordinance as strong as possible. It added 8 languages to the coverage in that geographic area. It's been a bit tough to track implementation. Some of the community organizations in Chicago have certainly done a great job and they've tried. But what I notice is that even some of the, it's not in an ordinance, but some of the implementation policies and communications norms with staff members in another jurisdiction, that is the City of Chicago's Board of Elections, that can be just as powerful in terms of the impact for the voters, whether it's adding languages, adding signs, getting feedback about whether the signs are working or not. You all know who do this work just at a very nitty-gritty level, how communication with the folks who work so hard to put on our elections is so crucial. And the community monitoring that other speakers have discussed is of absolute significance in the Chicago area as well. I wanted to talk a little bit, jumping off of where Fee left off, discussing state voting rights acts as a great opportunity. And there is a Illinois Voting Rights Act bill. It's a bill right now and something that we, our partners at United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations, an incredible multiracial coalition in Illinois, and other partners are trying to pass. Illinois has a Voting Rights Act already. It's outdated. It's one of the old school versions of a Voting Rights Act and certainly not as strong as it needs to be. It was important at that time, back over 10 years ago, but needs to be modernized per what all these other states are doing and setting an amazing example. There is a language access provision in that bill, and I can talk about the thresholds and whatnot if anyone's interested, but it does go by the best practices we've been hearing about today, lowering the thresholds, adding some creativity to what it could mean to be a community who's covered by this sort of approach. And I want to say that, I think you all know this, but these state voting rights acts, they're often like 4 or 5 or more bills in one. And so they have a lot of amazing components, even in addition to language access. And so that's what the organizing is looking like in Illinois for this bill that will hopefully, fingers crossed, become a law someday. Because actually one of the big pushes for the Illinois Voting Rights Act bill is community members trying to address vote dilution, including in Black communities in places like the East St. Louis area of Southwestern Illinois. So it can be very different sorts of community experiences that cause people to come together to want to push for a state level voting protection. And of course that takes some time to hear each other out, to hear what are different communities' priorities when it comes to trying to improve our laws. And I know we probably want to get to some more questions and things, so I can go through a little bit more briefly before turning it back to Viveka. But one thing I noticed from being on both the community organization side of this type of advocacy over the years, and also now, as of the last several years in a legal organization, is just how important it is for us all, and valuable and fun it is for us all to be coordinated across different types of organizations in playing different roles. We're good at different things, whether it's on election day when we're trying to address a barrier, or if it's more so in trying to pass a law or make a policy change, or even just navigate a testy meeting with an election official who feels defensive and who's working really hard and is probably tired and overstretched and is feeling defensive about an additional ask our communities are making. I think it's been really heartening to work alongside different peer organizations who have different types of strategies of achieving change different sets of professional skills, aptitude for connecting with different language communities. That's really been key to anything, we're not done yet, but anything we have achieved in terms of progress has required us to learn how to work together well, and especially when there are threats, especially when there's backtracking or other sorts of threats to our language access. I'm based in Indiana more so these days. We don't have Section 203 coverage there. We don't have any kind of voluntary assistance. Sometimes we learn, I was talking to someone in the lunch break about some very micro level, few translated forms or something, but those clerks don't even want anyone to know about it, because then they'll be under fire by the state, probably by our state AG or something like that. So it can take some time, certainly, to figure out, could it even be someone being able to take a friend or family member to the polls and feel comfortable in their right to do so? Could that be a step ahead for a community like that doesn't have much in terms of resources at this time? There is a group that I have the privilege of getting to work with out there called Hoosier Asian American Power, and they do multilingual phone banking around election time. So they at least have some data where the state does not, and probably will not for some time. But at least through some of the community initiatives, there is some assessing of the need and the value and of reaching out to voters in different languages and in different ways. So I'm gonna pause there and turn it back to V, but thank you so much for the chance to be with you all today.
Thank you so much, Ami. That was great. I have one short question that I'd love to ask you both, and then I'd like to open up for a question from the audience. So the question I have is, what do you see as the biggest, what are the biggest opportunities you see right now for expanding language access beyond the federal floor, and where do you see the biggest risks or pushback? We can start with you.
I think that we have both talked about this, but I'll just emphasize again that I do think that state ERAs and their popularity over the last 5 years provide a really strong opportunity to push for language access beyond 203. And I think what's also really enriching about doing it that way is that there are states who have already done it, and so advocates can be talking to each other across states and to learn from each other. And one specific example of that is that the New York VRA, which passed a year before the Connecticut VRA, they did not expand the definition of language minority beyond what's included in the federal law, and that was an oversight, I believe, on their part. And so when Connecticut advocates started to work on their state VRA, they were aware of that, and they made sure that in drafting the language for the Connecticut VRA, they addressed that gap. Of course, there are states where there's no political will to pass state VRA, so I think in those jurisdictions that obviously a state VRA doesn't really have legs, but I think people here today have uplifted a number of examples where folks can advocate on the city level or on the county level if you have friendly lawmakers in those places. In terms of the biggest risk or challenges, I think what I'm saying is not something that folks in this room haven't already uplifted or don't already know. But obviously, money and resources is a problem, especially I think for small election boards. And so, that continues to be a challenge. And I think one way states or advocates have navigated that particular challenge is sometimes putting the onus of translation on the state government versus having it trickle down to counties, and that is a way to sort of get around potential opposition from local election administrators that might fear the burden that it puts on their resources and their staffing. And I think that those are significant concerns. And then I think one of the other challenges is just political will, especially in a moment where immigrants are under attack, and it may not be the most politically expedient thing to do right now to expand language access. And I would say that is particularly true with the narrative that non-citizens are illegally voting. So I think that creates a particular challenge in this moment as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Fee pointed out. Absolutely. I also see traction in informal collaborations and opening up the lines of communication between voters, advocates, and community organizations and election officials, whether it's on a micro level or a pilot program in the area of the election access that maybe seems feasible for that election official to move forward at a given time, and a broader, more documented and enforceable policy change with teeth, which is a great ultimate goal. And then we all have been in situations where we may not be able to get there right away. And so I really like pilot opportunities. Don't even have to call it a pilot program. I'm not trying to make it sound more formalized than it has to be, but just in a primary election or in another chance when it doesn't feel as high pressure or high stakes to the election official, trying something out and showing how a community organization may be able to help with some aspects of that too. Maybe linguistically are the best experts in the picture or otherwise have value to add. And I think if it really feels like something we're all invested in and working on together, it can be a less of a fight than something that sounds more daunting as a huge burden on an already burdened election official, is how it could come off with some of the bigger asks that we still make anyway, but that may take longer to make a reality.
Thank you. I'm going to take one question from the audience and then we'll close out. And I think I saw this hand first.
Hi, thank you for your time and for the great presentation. I had a question or a recommendation. In your experience, what have been more effective at the state level when it comes to whether pushing for a standalone language access bill itself, or utilizing the capacity and efforts and resources to just push for the BRA as a bill package that includes, most BRAs includes the expansion of language access, so standalone itself or BRA?
I can start by saying I don't think that is a one size fits all, but I do think that one advantage that folks have seen by having it be part of a more robust package like a BRA is something that Ami named, which is you end up bringing in a much bigger coalition of people who care about other voting rights issues beyond just language access. So then I think that creates an opportunity to really build a powerful coalition and bring more resources to the fight to do that. And then I think the other thing too, and this is purely anecdotal and kind of a guess, but one of the people that I interviewed at the Legal Defense Fund about their work on the Connecticut BRA, or I'm sorry, it was actually somebody from ACLU of Connecticut who made this, but we asked about the lack of opposition from local election officials to the bill, because implementation was going to be quite costly. And I think, one of the things that they named was that language access may have just gotten sort of buried in the larger bill, and so it wasn't sort of singled out as something that was exceptionally expensive. Because I think that Connecticut actually did have a standalone language access policy that failed. And I don't remember if that was before or after the state BRA was passed.
Agree that isn't an either or, depending on the will of the advocates, community leaders, and voters in that particular place. I do think we're finding in the Illinois-based work just how much people power is going to be needed to really push on the leaders to change the status quo, the state leaders to change the status quo, and the election officials to ask them to do more than what they're already doing. And so we're finding that in the absence of something comprehensive that many of our communities are working on together, that there can be some pitting against each other or making it seem like protections for one group could come at the cost of protections or care for another group. I don't think our advocacy organizations see it that way, and there may be some of this divisiveness may be unintentional, but it's happening nonetheless. And so I know that we're really guided again by the coalitions who we are held accountable to and who we just support with our legal work from behind the scenes. We go based on their strategies, but that's what I hear a lot from them, is they're really looking for how to make some of this more universal work across communities of color, and that they think ultimately that's the way to win the changes.
Thank you so much. A round of applause to our panelists. And we're going to be heading soon to break our groups, so you'll be able to continue this conversation, but I'm going to pass the mic to Jonathan.
Love the energy in this room, the connections, the conversations, the people. It's beautiful. Thank you. It's just a really wonderful day, or a really wonderful way to end the summit at this note. And what an incredible honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Secretary Xavier Becerra. Give it up. Want to hear it? Secretary Becerra's 32-year career is marked by a steadfast commitment to advancing immigrant justice, defending democracy, and protecting the health of our nation. From his 12-term tenure in the U.S. House of Representatives, to his role as Attorney General of California, to his historic appointment as the 25th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the first Latino and person of color to hold that office. As California's Attorney General, he was also the lead defender of the Affordable Care Act in court and a leading challenger to Trump 1.0's agenda through numerous legal actions. So, he knows how to fight. Secretary Becerra has been a national leader, and his leadership reminds us that democracy is strongest when it protects the dignity and participation of every person, regardless of language, background, or status. He's the son of working-class immigrant parents from Mexico and earned his Ph.D. from Stanford Law. It is with great pride that I present to you the Honorable Secretary Xavier Becerra.
Ramon, thank you very much for not just the introduction, but for the work that you do, for the work you all do. I think we all rest on your shoulders because oftentimes when we're policymakers or we get to be executives in large agencies, we're implementing what you put forward. And it was your dream that now we get to put in action. And so thank you for what you do. It does not get past those of us who have an opportunity, and I know that former Assembly Speaker Anthony, I just lost you. Where'd you go? Outside. He's probably doing business. We get to do some things, and we end up getting to take credit for them. But if you go back, the cauldron of where all that stuff started to heat up, when the ingredients got mixed in, is in rooms like this. And so I just want you to know, because I used to be in those rooms myself, and it is something that I know when you see that victory, you see that Section 203 has worked. It's like, yeah, I had a role in that. And while others may not know that, those of us who actually get to put our name behind some of these things, we do. And so I just want to say a very heartfelt thanks, because these days we have a politics where all some of these folks want is attention, even though they don't really do the work. And we can't let that happen, because it's all the little people who make the big people big. And I hope that you recognize that you have been there for so many people in so many ways. I'm not going to take up a whole lot of time. I think I was given close to 40 minutes. I usually only give them 4 minutes if I'm lucky. So I'm going to take a lot less time. But I did want to make sure I acknowledged everything you do, because most of the time you do with very little money. And I know how hard that is. I had a budget at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which never had enough. But to put that in context, because I want to make sure that you all don't say, oh my God, he didn't really say that. My budget was really big. Department of Defense has a big budget so that you can compare. The budget at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is 2 times bigger than the budget of the Department of Defense. And I never had enough. Because you see, we have so neglected mental health that when I finally got more money as a result of President Biden's pushing Congress for the first time to give us money dedicated for certain streams of mental health, it went like that. But at least we got to do it. And so that's where you say to yourself, it's still not enough, but we got somewhere. And this is why this discussion about voting rights, about increasing the playing field, opening the door to more people, giving folks who probably couldn't understand or pick up everything that we're saying here today have an actual chance to cast those votes, to let us fight for more, is what's so very important. So here's what I want to tell you. First, recognize the moment. This is not a usual election cycle. We are not in a normal political situation. We are not dealing with the usual suspects. When we try to do something, we're going to have to understand the playing field we're on. We had a bit of a discussion about this yesterday when I had a chance to participate in some of the discussions. This is a different world. And it is not a world where you typically play. Because you typically try to do things after you've read the rules or you've looked at the law. You read Section 203 and you know what it tells you you can do. And so you work under that prescription. There are people who are reading that same thing and doing something very, very different. And so we first have to recognize this is a different moment in time. And so if it is truly a different moment in time, then know how to capture it. Again, Speaker Rendon gave a great example yesterday when he mentioned that the license bill that allowed folks who were undocumented to get driver's licenses was something that came on the scene for a vote about an hour and a half before session concluded in the state legislature. And that's because the moment got ripe and you had to be ready. I will give you a similar example. When we were trying to craft the Affordable Care Act in 2009 and 2010, we went back and forth, back and forth. House passed a bill, Senate passed a bill. They were different. We disagreed on what should be the final product. We were about out of time. And we got to the point where the only way to do the measure was to do it through the reconciliation process, which you all probably are very familiar with now because that's what the Republicans used to get through their ugly bill. We were on the verge of losing the moment because the clock was about to tick to zero. And we didn't have the votes in the House. Speaker Pelosi and our team, I was part of leadership, we were trying to find, we were whipping all the time. And by the way, this is Democrats. We weren't looking for Republicans. We were looking just for Democrats. And we couldn't get Democrats enough of them. We were in the majority, not by much, but we had the majority. We couldn't get to 218. And so on the final week, in the final days of the reconciliation process before it closed, we had to make a decision. And so the speaker said, we're going to take the bill to the floor for a vote. We did not have the votes. We were about 4 votes shy. And we were just going to work all that day to try to get the 4 Democrats we needed. By the time the evening was finishing, we had found the votes. But it took forever to convince some of these Democrats. And had the speaker said to us, you can't get there, we're not going to get there, and we're not going to be embarrassed by having this fail and have President Obama have a real failure on a signature bill. Nancy simply said, we just got to go to the floor. And we got to test these guys if they're serious about voting no. We got to test these guys if they're serious about not being with us. But you got to understand your moment. Because if you're going to test them, you better win. And that's my next point. We got to win. Because in this is a brave new world where everyone wants to see the victories. And if you don't have victories, you're considered a loser. And if you're a loser, no one pays attention to you. You won't get the hits on social media. You won't get asked to do news interviews. You've got to have some victories. And so this army, you've been warriors all this time. You know what it takes to make voting rights real. You know what changes we have to make in the law to help us navigate to a better place for voting. You understand all those things. Do you get the politics? Do you understand what it would take today to get the win? Which is, by the way, different than what it was 4 months ago, before redistricting in Texas took shape. It's different than what it was a year ago, before Donald Trump won an election to be president again. And so, do we understand what it will take to win? And that's where I say to you, sometimes you've got to not change your uniform, but understand that this is a different war. And I would say to you that today, with just a couple of 2 or 3 weeks left in this legislative calendar in Sacramento, show me how you get people to pay attention to this. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying show me. Show me that you know how to marshal the resources to get these legislators to zero in on this, when some of them are right now wondering if they're going to be running for Congress and not stay in their state legislative seat. If some of them are wondering how to take out that neighboring Republican, or how to, whatever the case is, how do they get them focused on this? And if we can do that, then quickly find those allies. Because someone's got to run this bill for you. Who's going to carry our water? And let's figure that out real fast. And let's come out with a win. Now, the win may not be legislation and new law. A win may just be getting people to recognize that right now we're in a really interesting moment. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to pass legislation. But I guarantee you, if you were to poll Californians today, they are more inclined to be supportive of immigrants than they were a year ago. What does that mean? Well, it could mean that they're willing to help us drive towards a solution that lets us make some changes. Maybe even in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know if we've got the capabilities to get a California public behind such an effort, because you do need to get the public's attention. And so I would say there are ways to get this moving and get a win. But I do believe you got to focus. And so here's where I turn to the intentionality of it all. I think most of you would agree that we never have good wins without having really worked hard and probably been a little lucky. But right now, luck is not going to get us anywhere. It's all about intention. And so I don't know in your discussions over the last couple of days if you all have sort of decided who you need to pick off as your allies in the legislature and who will be your opponents and how you have to thwart their efforts. But if you want to win in the legislature in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I hope there's been a discussion, or you will have a quick discussion on how you get there. Too often we forget our superpowers because we're low on funding. We rely on a lot of young folks who don't have the vast experience, don't have the relationships with the legislators to get the votes. Too often we think we're on the opposite end. Too often we don't think the public, the voters, get what we're trying to do. Too often they think we are too much on the extreme. But sometimes we can strike a chord with them. And here is where you have the superpower, because you understand voting rights, you understand language access better than most people. And you can take advantage of a moment like today when Californians are wondering, what the heck is going on with our attack on immigrants? And you have an opportunity to take that where there's now a growing orientation and sympathy towards the plight of immigrants and say, and guess what? We could get a lot of these folks who actually are U.S. citizens that are of immigrant background to become more participatory and help us change the political dynamic that we face now. And I think you get a lot of support from the California electorate. And so whether it is over the next 2 or 3 weeks, which I think would be very difficult, over it's a march towards something in the future, there are opportunities. And so I'm principally here to ground us a bit in the work that we have to do and help you understand your superpowers. I think Diego Casillas, Diego's still here? Diego, I think, made it pretty clear. We expand voting access. People will come. They will vote. Folks in these communities want to feel heard. They want to participate. And quite honestly, they've been watching what's going on, and they want to make sure that their voice is now part of that process. They were at one point those immigrants who are being chased and apprehended. And they probably still will be. But at least now they can say, wait a minute, I'm a U.S. citizen. And so I think we have opportunities, and I hope we will take advantage of them. And this is an opportunity for us to decide what that battle will look like. And I urge you to be focused, to not let the trees hide the forest for you. Right now, with all this noise going on, there's an opportunity to redirect and channel all those, that empathy, that concern, and move it. And quite honestly, what we're trying to do is pretty simple. Just trying to make the voting process a little bit more accessible. We already do sample ballots. We already do the materials for people. What we're saying is maybe just make it so that the actual ballot is translated, not just the sample. Who wants to? I mean, in these days where everything is by phone and you no longer have to use paper, why is it that people still are being forced to take a look at a paper document and then try to fill out another paper document? You know, it's as old-fashioned as you can get. And so maybe we can convince people. But you all are the experts. You've done this. You've got that superpower. And I urge you to use it, because this is a moment. And you never know what that moment will offer you. And so while that window is open, let us jump through it. I hope that each and every one of you recognizes that it is in your reach. You have great institutions. Haas has made it possible for us to collect folks together. Common Cause has been fighting this forever. The Voting Rights Project at UCLA, is your brain and muscle and knowing how to get this done right, we've got what we need. You've got Speaker Rendon here he will, by himself find you the 41 votes you need in the assembly, all the votes you need. He will help. But I think this is an opportunity, and I urge you to take all this work you've done and recognize the moment and use your superpowers. I thank you for letting me come and address you. I'm not going to get into Section 203 and analyze it for you and tell you what you already know about its history. I'm fortunate. I was the successor to Congressman Ed Roybal, who actually was the one who helped institute 203 in the Voting Rights Act. And so I am fortunate to follow a man who left a legacy and that we want to build on. Let's build on this. Let's recognize where we are. Let's seize this moment. And let's make it clear that that noise going on in DC is not going to make a difference to us. In California, we'll keep our eye on the prize. Thank you very much for letting me come.
We'll give one more round of applause for Secretary Becerra. As always, we appreciate your wise words and your contribution to not just the state of California, but the United States as a whole. So thank you. You made me think of some things, actually. Jonathan, I'm going off script right now. Yeah, it's happening. I get to do this because I'm the executive director of California Common Cause, but Secretary Becerra made a comment there that I want to kind of dovetail off of, about how the reason why we get to do what we do is because so many people came before us. Because so many people fought for things, stood up, struggled for us. We get to do all of this work because someone did it before us. And that's something we always have to remember. And as the new executive director of California Common Cause, today I had the amazing privilege of being in a room with two particular luminaries, two former executive directors for California Common Cause. Unfortunately, Kathy Fang had to leave, but also my good friend, Jonathan Stein. Please, round of applause. And I've known Jonathan for 13 years, so it has been my joy to always embarrass him. And it's because of the hard work of Kathy Fang and Jonathan Stein and all of those that came before them, that worked with them, that I am able to stand up here today and to continue the work that they're doing. And I also want to highlight some other individuals, particularly one who's here today. Our former board chair, Mindy. Our former Common Cause board chair, Mindy, please, round of applause. Mindy has also dedicated so much of her time to California Common Cause and all of the hard work we've done, that I just wanted to give a little bit of acknowledgement to those people whose shoulders I stand on, because I could not do this work without them. So from me to you, thank you for all that you've done. Appreciate it. So that's the mushy bits. But I also want to highlight some other things I heard today, which were that someone in the federal side mentioned, if we're going to get some of these federal laws passed, we have to start working now. Like, we really have to start. We can't start thinking, how are we going to do it when we get into power and control? We have to start working on that now. And as a recent graduate of the Goldman School, I'm a big proponent of trying to fight now. if we wait for power, we won't be ready for it when we get it. So start planning and thinking now about the ways we can improve voter language access, how we can improve Section 203, how we can improve our democracy broadly. And so it's very important that when you go home this evening, you say, what am I going to start doing and working on now? Because eventually my groups, my team, the people on my side here, whatever side that is, we're going to get some power. And I want to be ready on day one with a plan. So that's my challenge that I want to give to all of you as you go home today. And you think about everything that's happened here today is, what are you going to do now for when things are ready to change? Because I'm from Alabama, born and raised, and we have this is butchering the phrase, but it's something to the effect of like, bad times don't last forever. They just don't. So is now bad for our democracy? I think so. I wholeheartedly think so. But bad times don't last always. So when those bad times are gone, what are you going to do? What plans are you going to have in place? What organizations are you going to be standing with? Who's going to be with you when the fight is ready to start? That's what we're doing here now. So find your friends, find your advocates, and let's remember to be ready when it's time to actually fight. All right? So as we wrap up today, I want to thank the Haas Junior Fund. Raul, thank you so much for all of your support. I want to thank you all for being here for a very, very long day. I hope it's left you inspired. I hope it leaves you with new connections. I hope you're ready to continue this fight for an inclusive democracy. I want to thank our partners, PANA, the Asian Law Caucus, ACLU of Southern California. Thank you all for your hard work and contribution. So as the times tell us to stop, to give up, to lay down, and I know I can count on this room and the people in this room to never quit and to keep fighting and to fight no matter how hard it gets. So keep on fighting. But now it is time to have a little fun. So please join us for a reception at Juju's Kitchen and Cocktails. It's right across the street at 1501 L Street. Again, that's Juju's Kitchen and Cocktails. So please keep your name tags with you. So if you have any issues at the reception and people can get to know you and speak to you at the reception. And so I'm excited that we can all go over, have some food, have some drinks, have some laughs, and get ready for the fight that's coming, because tonight we party. All right. Thank you.